Hi, my name is Duncan Kerber, and I'm the instructor of the 7 Lessons Writing course. I've taught writing to students at the university level for 11 years now, and I brought many of those lessons into this course. A few years ago, I published a textbook with Oxford University Press on effective writing, and I brought much of that material into this course. I believe if you can do these 7 lessons, you don't have to worry about the grammar book, those big style books. Your writing will improve immensely if you can incorporate these lessons into it. And by incorporating these lessons, you will write more clearly, precisely, directly, in all kinds of writing at the sentence level. This course is focused on sentences. If you can put together a great sentence, everything else falls into place. So try out these exercises, apply it to your writing today, and ingrain those lessons into you. If you have any questions about the course, just send me a note. I usually respond within 24 hours. Thank you. So in this video, I want to talk about how this course functions and how you can get the most out of it. First, you have the lesson video. So each video is short, but there's about over 2 hours of videos here that go into very specific sentence level editing and writing issues. So make sure you watch all the videos. And if you don't understand something, re-watch the videos. If you have any questions, you can always send me a message. Now, I've also added, and this is very unique to this course, I believe, writing exercises. So using the assignment feature in Udemy, which is a recent invention to the Udemy platform, I've added a number of exercises. These are the very same exercises my university students do in first-year composition classes. It's really important that you try out these lessons. It's easy to watch a video and think you understand what it's all about, but you don't really know if you understand it until you do the exercises. So after each lesson section, I've got 1 or 2 exercises that will ask you to apply the lessons of that section. And once you submit those, I will get a notification, and every few weeks, I go through and review those exercises, and I'll comment on them and tell you whether you're on the right track. So you can get that feedback from me as if you were in my university class, and that allows you to see if you're on the right track or see if you need to go back and rewatch those videos. And then finally, these lessons that you're learning, once you've tried them out in exercise form, you should then try them out in real writing. Whether you're writing stories, whether you're writing journalism, whether you're writing academic papers or business reports, you should be then applying them to real life genres to see if you can really get it into the writing you're doing for your boss, for your teachers, and so on. So that's how this should function so that you really get the most out of it. If you have any questions, you can always send me a message through the course messaging feature. There are many different types of wordiness, but really we can boil it all down to 4. So if you eliminate these 4 types of wordiness from your writing, it'll be so much clearer and your readers will appreciate it. They won't be walking through quicksand, so to speak. So what are those 4 types that we're going to go through in these lectures? The first type we're going to look at is redundancy. So redundancy is saying the same thing more than once. Now, in some kind of educational settings, there's a thing called planned redundancy, and sometimes I might even do this in these lectures, and that is to repeat myself. But at the sentence level, which is where we're primarily focused in this course, redundancy is dead weight. So it's extra words that don't have to be there. And most often we don't even notice this dead weight in our sentences. So that's type number 1. Wordiness type number 2 is called phony intensifiers. So these are often very little words sprinkled liberally across a writing
that end in Y. So think of words like very and basically. In our speech these days, when we talk to our friends, we often say very a lot. We say basically, we say honestly. There are these little words that just get thrown in all the time to intensify what we're saying. So we're very interested in something. We're honestly sure that's going to happen. And they don't really serve any purpose. And I'll show you some examples of that in the next few lectures. The third type of wordiness is a thing called stretchers. And stretchers are combinations of very small words. So the words themselves are not big, they're not heavy, but in combination with other little ones, they prolong a sentence. They take the sentence longer than it should be. And most of the time you can actually cut out these stringy phrases from your writing and the sentence still stands strong, it still works, it still functions. So they serve no necessary purpose in the sentence. One of the classic stretchers that I find in school writing, in academic writing, is the phrase, the fact that. The fact that. And I'll show you in a subsequent lecture how to remove that and justify removing it. Another one that comes up in a lot of writing, whether it's business or academia, is the stretcher in order to. And often we can just say to. So those are just a little bit of a taste of the third type of wordiness that's so common in work and business writing and academic writing and political writing, and that is the stretcher. The fourth type of wordiness that we're going to look at in these lectures is thickeners. So thickeners are big words, heavy words that very few people actually use in everyday speech. So they're often used in legal documents. Some people use them in academic writing to look smart, things like therein and whereby. But these are words we don't usually use in regular conversation. And those thickeners can really weigh down a sentence. They can make it heavy. So now let's turn to the next few lectures that deal with these four types specifically. So I'll give you specific examples of these, and I'll give a justification for why you should remove them. I think by the end of the editing process of removing these from your writing, you'll find a much tighter, much clearer, much more direct style of writing. The first roadblock to clarity in your writing is redundancy. Now, we typically think of redundancy in most writing on the level of the idea. So, in my experience as a writing instructor, students will often submit papers that have said the same thing, presented the same idea in multiple points of the paper. That's not what I'm talking about in this lecture. I want to zoom in on the sentence. So all of these lectures are about the sentence. And I always believe if we can work on our sentences and get those sentences into shape, everything else will fall into place. So we're zooming in, we're going on that micro level to the sentence. And redundancy can occur there too. And often this is the kind of redundancy we never even notice. We just aren't looking that carefully at our sentences. So redundancy can exist on the level of the word. So that means you're using two words or more in the sentence that are actually performing the same meaningful function. So they're actually saying the same thing. So now let's look at some real examples of redundancy in practice. So the first sentence here, the board was long in size. What is redundant in that sentence? Well, the word long is all about size. It means size. So to say it's long in size is redundant. We don't need to say that. It doesn't add anything to the sentence. Why make the reader process more words than they need to? Why don't we just move on to our next point about that board? So what's the edit here? Well, you just simply cross in size out and you're done. Here's another sentence. The plane circled around the airport before landing. So I'm sure you guessed here, looking at it now very carefully on a word-by-word analysis, that the verb circled, a really good verb, very strong verb, means the same as the next word, which is around. So simply you could cross out around. Another example is the sentence, we share in common a love for baseball. So the redundancy here at the sentence level is simply that the verb share means the same as in common. Of course, if we share something, it's in common. So there's no reason to say in common after that. We can just cross that out. Another example that kind of gets me when I'm editing other people's writing, and I always cross this out, is my invention is a great new innovation. So the redundancy here, the extra word here, is new, because the noun innovation implies that it's new, because if this device or whatever the object is, the invention, wasn't an innovation, then it wouldn't be new. It would be a copy of somebody else's work. So we can just cross out new in that case. So here are some other examples listed on the slide, and I want you to pause this video and look through those and edit them, simply crossing out the unnecessary words in the sentence. This does not require recasting the sentences, rewriting the sentences. All it is just crossing a few words out and collapsing the sentence down to its essence. And you'll note that in these edits for redundancy that the final sentence that you come up with still means the same thing as the original. It just gets over with faster. To sum up, the meaning in these extra words was always found somewhere else in the sentence, usually in a previous word or a word nearby. So it was kind of duplicated meaning. So to remove that makes the sentence much more efficient, much cleaner, much tighter. The second type of wordiness is the phony intensifier. These are often used to strain to appear confident. So maybe, and this is the paradox of the phony intensifier, maybe the person using it is not as confident as they actually are. They feel like they need to use these little words throughout their speech to show confidence. And as we know, people who are confident don't talk about being confident. So these are the little words that really serve no purpose in a sentence. They might be words like absolutely, or basically, or certainly, or really. I mean, in people's regular speech, really is used a lot in conversation. Also very, totally. And what you'll find is you can delete these, just cross them out of your sentences, and the sentence still functions. And often the meaning is like the redundant words that I talked about in a previous lecture. The meaning is likely found in another part of the sentence. In regular speech, intensifiers can be used simply to fill dead air. So we don't know what to say. And instead of saying or ah, we use these intensifiers to fill in that gap. But we don't want that in writing. We don't need those in writing. And these intensifiers often, but don't always, end in Y or ly. So now let's look on the slide for some full sentence examples of the use of phony intensifiers. And the first one is, I am absolutely confident in my abilities. Now somebody could just say, I am confident in my abilities. Does the absolutely really add anything there? Actually, it starts to make me question, why is this person being so insistent about being confident with the intensifier absolutely? The second one is, we are basically good students. So this is, again, intensifying something. It's qualifying how good these students are. We don't know why. It's basically, that's like saying virtually good students. Well, you're suggesting that there's some small fraction that are not good, and that raises questions. Another one is, David certainly needs to water the garden today. I guess the garden is parched. It's the middle of summer. That garden needs water. And really the certainly, which is the intensifier here, doesn't add anything. I mean, if the garden needs it, it needs it. We can just say he needs to water the garden today. Another one is, I really want to go to the store. I want to go to the store or not. What does really add to that? I mean, you would need more context there. whatever it is about that store, maybe. Maybe the person is trying to get the latest Air Jordan shoes or something like that, and maybe it's appropriate to say really. But in most cases, really is just an extra word that we can remove. Another one that comes up is often used in fiction writing. So somebody might write, the dog is very ugly. Now, first of all, this is a problem because it tells the reader that the dog is ugly instead of showing it. So if you want to show it, you would describe the features of that dog that make it so ugly. You wouldn't just tell the reader it's ugly. Ugly can mean so many different things. And very, which is a common intensifier that really doesn't serve much purpose, doesn't help us see this dog. So what's the difference between an ugly dog and a very ugly dog? I'm not sure. I don't know in my mind. So if it doesn't help us to see that dog, then what purpose does that intensifier have in the sentence? And that intensifier very was even cited, a century or more ago by the great author Mark Twain, who said, substitute damn every time you're inclined to write very. Your editor will delete it, and the writing will be just as it should be. So Mark Twain identified this a long, long time ago. And certainly in our speech today, particularly amongst young people, very is used a lot for no real purpose. In academic writing or political writing, these intensifiers have a more dangerous use. So people will often use them to close off debate. So if you're writing any public document, you really shouldn't be closing off debate. Maybe you do have opposing people out there that are against your views, but really you want to open up the debate. And if your ideas are good, they will win the debate in the public sphere. But sometimes in academic writing or politics, people will say something like this: it is obvious that heart meant something quite different. So there, the phony intensifier is, it is obvious, which we can critique if we know this argument, if we know this person named Hart. Maybe it's not so obvious. Someone might write naturally, no one wants to sacrifice that much. And here's another one. I mean, to say naturally means that you've closed off debate. No one can have an opinion other than the one that you're saying, which is no one wants to sacrifice that much. A politician might say something like, of course the solution is simple, lower taxes. Well, maybe there is another option there in the political debate other than lowering taxes, but that's closed off by this intensifier of course. So this lesson on the phony intensifier has hopefully raised your awareness of this often useless word that we pepper around our sentences. So the first thing to do is to take your piece of writing and maybe do Control F, find in Word, type in these words like very and basically and totally, and see if you're using them. And the easy edit is simply to delete them. And your sentence will still function, it'll still work. Grammatically speaking, stylistically, it'll be a lot better. So look out for these in your writing. And you might also question, why am I using these? Why do I feel the need in my writing to strain to appear confident? Perhaps you need to provide more evidence for the statements that you're making because you maybe subconsciously don't feel confident in what you're saying. The third type of wordiness that inhibits clarity is stretchers. So stretchers are just little words put in combinations, but they don't add any quality to your writing. So they only add quantity. They actually make the sentence longer, but they don't add any meaning there. I liken these stretchers to the food industry's practice of putting fillers into chicken nuggets, into ground beef. And those fillers are not nutritious. They don't provide any benefit health-wise to the consumer, but they're put in to fill out the food product. And that's the same thing with stretchers. They add no meaning to your sentences. They just force the reader to kind of sift through the sentence to find the essential or important meaning around all this other stuff. So here are a few sentences that I've put on the screen, and let's identify the stretching words here. These are not big words. These are just little words, but they really serve no purpose. So the first one is, in order to get to the store, we have to cross the railroad tracks. And in this case, the stretching words are in order to. So we could just say to get to the store, we have to cross the railroad tracks. Now look at the second one. At this point in time, let's read the book. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 words. And at this point in time takes up the majority of the sentence. We could say something like, now let's read the book. So that one word, now, replaces 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words in a stringy stretcher phrase. Another one is used in academia, and that is Hemingway's use of economy is his hallmark. Well, in this case, the stretching phrase is use of, so we could just say Hemingway's economy is his hallmark. Another one is William persuades by means of logic. Again, like the Hemingway example, you could just say William persuades by logic or with logic. By means of doesn't help us. Now, two that come up in a lot of fiction writing, and I see this all the time, and that is the word started and the word began. So people always seem to want to emphasize that an action began, even though when you invoke the verb itself, you are beginning the action. So if I say something like, Sandy started to stop crying, well, started doesn't need to be there. We could just say Sandy stopped crying because stopping inherently starts at some point. There's no need to say it started, that's implied. And then also Kunal began to punch. Well, what about Kunal punched? Kunal punched the man, could be the sentence in a fiction story. And in that case, we know it's beginning when the punch is done, so when the action comes, we know it starts. There's no reason to emphasize the starting, the beginning of it. And then finally, a common academic example is the fact that music is a big business is well known. The fact that comes up in a lot of sentences, not usually at the start, actually, as that example shows, but commonly in the middle of a sentence. And most of the time, I would say probably 95% of the time, you can simply cross that out. So you can say, that music is a big business is well known. And in the middle of sentences, often just be completely crossed out. And these stretchers remind me of a great quote by the writer George Orwell, who wrote the great book 1984. And that is, if it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. And if you edit out these stretchers, you'll find that your sentences get to the point faster. You're not having these winding constructions that go all over the place before getting to that point. And I think it also emphasizes those key words more because they're not being shrouded by these stretchers. For example, the point about the man punching. Well, that's a strong verb, punch, but it gets hidden by begin or start. So your next task is to go through your writing and search for these stretching phrases and strike them out right when you find them. Some people use what are called thickeners. This is the fourth type of wordiness so common to people's writing. And these thickeners are often unusual or archaic words. They're words from a different time, or they're words that are typically only used by lawyers or the Queen of England. So if you're a lawyer or you're the Queen of England, keep using these words. But if you're like the rest of us, you should get these things out of your writing. And a good test of these thickeners is, would you use these words in regular speech? So you're talking to your mother, you're talking to your father, you're talking to your friends. Would you use words like heretofore or herein or whereby and so on? No, we wouldn't use those. We never use those when we're talking to regular people. But somehow in some documents, particularly academic writing, but also business writing to a general public, these words pop up. Some students in academia feel that if they use these words, they look really smart. Well, you don't. You don't look smart. I actually think the best academic writing, and I've been widely published in academia, the best academic writing is the writing that seems deceptively simple, but the ideas that you've got in that writing are very deep. They're complex, they're subtle, but we don't use these words to show off in that kind of writing. Instead, I think most smart readers, smart editors know they don't fit, the typical writing that we're doing. And they're like boat anchors, just dropping in the middle of a sentence. So here are a few sentences that employ these thickeners. And these are the ones I've just mentioned. So for example, someone could say, it has been heretofore mentioned that Shakespeare's work is significant. When was the last time you used heretofore? So you might just say, someone mentioned that Shakespeare's work is significant, or Bob mentioned, or whatever. Herein lies the key point. Well, I think most people say, here is the key point, or this is the key point. Someone might write, Sarah found the means whereby she could cheat on tomorrow's test. Well, you almost never use whereby, so let's just say, Sarah found the means to cheat on tomorrow's test. Also, sometimes in academia and business writing and political writing, we use the phrases former and latter. So these words remind the reader to go back actually to a previous sentence and associate former and latter with two previous nouns. For example, you might say something like, John likes ice cream and Joe likes popsicles. The former also eats deli sandwiches, while the latter eats subs. The problem with this sentence and with these thickeners, former and latter, is it requires the reader to do some mental gymnastics. It's very small mental gymnastics, not a big deal. But if you do this a lot, it can weigh down the reader because the reader actually has to make a mental connection between former, in this case, and that's John. I'm just looking at the sentence myself. And latter has to go back mentally to Joe. And if you've got a tired reader, you've got a reader that's inattentive, you're making it really hard on them to have to go back and figure out who is what. You see this in a lot of textbooks, academic textbooks, former and latter. Don't make it hard on the reader to process your work. All of these wordiness examples make the reader do more work, and you don't want to do that. You want to make it easy on them. You want them to glide through your writing. And former and latter do not work easily. It makes their job much more difficult. Go back to your writing and look for these difficult words. I'm sure you can think of others that might come up, and remove them, replace them, recast the sentence if you have to smooth over that speed bump. In this final lecture, I just want to talk about some possible questions from students. So I've taught this unit on wordiness and clarity many, many times to hundreds and hundreds of students. And these are kind of the most common questions that come up. If you have any questions, you can obviously send me those questions within this course. So the first question or comment that I get from students is, doesn't writing clearly mean you're dumbing things down? And I don't believe that's so. I believe that we should write clearly, but then have very interesting, challenging, deep ideas. One example I often give in class is the book by Stephen Hawking called A Brief History of Time. This was a bestseller, so he sold 10 million or more copies of this because it talked about difficult issues with physics and the universe, but in a very straightforward style that even children could understand. So we shouldn't think that we're dumbing things down. I mentioned in the exercise lecture of this unit that some people feel they are writing like a child when they write in an economical or clear style, and it need not be that way. You don't have to write really short words or really short sentences. Now, that made a whole career for Hemingway when he wrote his novels. You read Hemingway and it's just extremely bare kind of writing, but that, he made a career out of that. People love that style of writing. Now, a lot of people didn't like it either. So there are two sides to this. There's a debate over that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be your style all the time. Sometimes, though, when you're dealing with very difficult concepts in a book you're writing or an article, it's good to take it down to its simplest form, and it'll help you think more clearly. Now, some students also ask me, well, if I'm economical, if I'm clear in my writing, I won't meet my word count. So I've got to write 2,000 words for my professor. How am I going to do that if I'm very clear? Well, of course, you're going to be shorter, but I had a great professor tell me once that if you are not meeting the word count because you're very clear in your writing, that you simply should add in more ideas. So more scenes in your fiction, more quotations in your academic papers, more data in your business reports. And that will get you to the word count. but padding it with stuff that makes it difficult on the reader just makes the writing ineffective. Another question I get is, can't you be redundant for emphasis? Well, of course you can. You can do that, and I've done that throughout this course, because in education, sometimes we need to emphasize certain things. We need to repeat ourselves because that helps learning to some degree. But as you'll note throughout this section on wordiness and clarity, a lot of the examples I'm giving are not intentional. They're not things that people are using to repeat a point or to help the reader. They're actually things that either they're not noticing or they're doing to show off, and that doesn't help anybody. So you can do what's called planned redundancy, but it has to be intentional and has to have a purpose. And then a final question I get from students sometimes is, this is really picky stuff. So you're editing out a word here, a phrase here. How does that really help my writing? Well, I argue that if you do this throughout a long document, it has a profound effect because it's all over the document. You're taking out all of those weeds off the lawn, so to speak, and the resulting lawn, or your writing, looks much, much better after this editing process. So I believe it has a strong effect. But more importantly, I think that whether you take out the fact that, or wherein, or whereby, or some other phrase that I've talked about here, isn't really the point. It is there to help you identify wordiness, but the greater point here, and I think what will happen at the end of this section, when you've applied these things, when you've done the exercises and so on, is that you'll start developing a greater eye, a more objective eye for what you're putting down on the page. And I think that's much more important than any specific example I've given you here in this course, that you can develop that eye. I hope by taking this course that you will be able to see other examples, things that I haven't even talked about. And a lot of students come up to me and they say, is this an example of wordiness? And it's an example I've never thought of. It's something I've never seen, and they are right. It is an example of wordiness. And that's the transcendent moment. That's when I'm happy to see that the writer has gone beyond my lessons and has realized their eye, their editor's eye on the page. They've seen another example. And that awareness is amazing. If you can have that awareness when you're writing your sentences, you'll have even greater effect on your writing as you go forward.
The typical sentence in the English language has a lot of parts of speech, and certainly the grammar books will tell you what those parts of speech are. But I believe that there's one word that stands out more, that contributes more to making effective meaning that readers can easily understand, and that is the verb. Choosing the right verbs in your writing is extremely important because they provide the concrete meaning that readers need to see what you're trying to say, to see it in their mind's eyes. Also, as I'll show you later in this set of lectures, verbs provide movement. And in any kind of storytelling, even in academic writing, and I'll show you that later in these lectures, we need things to move along. Traditional grammar books make verbs really complicated, however, and they will describe different forms of verbs. So verbs can be intransitive, transitive, past tense, present tense, future tense, progressive tense, perfect tense, present perfect tense, past perfect tense, future perfect tense, indicative moods in verbs, imperative moods, subjunctive moods, active voice, passive voice, first person, second person, third person, singular, plural. There are a lot of variables with verbs, and I'm running out of breath here just describing them. This set of lectures will not go into all of those forms and modifications of verbs. I'm just interested in the root verbs, whether it's present or simple past tense. That's all we need to focus on to understand how wonderful verbs really are. Without verbs, sentences fall apart, so they become what are called fragments. So if you've had an editor or maybe a professor mark fragment when grading your writing, perhaps you are missing a verb in the sentence. Now, some great writers use fragments. In journalism, often headlines are fragments. So someone will say something like, New York's top 10 most congested intersections. Now, that's not a grammatically correct sentence because we're missing a verb there. But they present problems in a lot of beginning writers' writing because you start getting this kind of headline style that has no flow. It doesn't have any forward movement. So what is a verb? I think from grade 3 English class, you probably thought of it as an action word, and that's partly true. So verbs are not just action words. And I want to relate a definition from the Chicago Manual of Style. They say that a verb can show the existence of a condition or a state of being, such as emotion. That is in addition to describing action. So there are actually 2 points or 2 sides to the verb. Some verbs are straight action, like run, throw, walk, hit. Those are very concrete verbs. And then we have other verbs like is, was, were, which are more about a condition or state of being, as the Chicago Manual of Style describes it. So keep that definition in mind, because as we go through these lectures on verbs, I'm going to talk about the different types of verbs and their effects on readers. If we want to make a great connection with our readers, we need to give the readers words that they immediately understand and can process, can visualize. So when we're talking about verbs, the best verbs for most writing are called concrete verbs. So these are the everyday verbs, the verbs that we've known for most of our lives since we were children. These are not big business words or political words. These are just everyday words like run and hit and walk and throw. These are all tangible actions. So in the first lecture of this section, I suggested that 1/2 of the definition of a verb is an action word. And so this is the type of word that we want to get more into our writing. We want to increase the ratio of concrete verbs, sometimes they're also called strong verbs, to other words. So the more of these concrete verbs you can get into your sentences, the better for readability, for easy processing by readers, because there's no misunderstanding with these verbs. There's no difficulty. The image pops up in the mind of the reader the second you say run, the second you say jump, or throw, or smack. There's no misunderstanding. Other verbs, as we'll talk about later in these lectures, are a little bit more difficult to process. They require maybe a little bit more education on the part of your readers, and they are often very abstract. They are not day-to-day words. Now, those words have a place in writing, so I wouldn't eliminate them completely, but we need to focus more on these concrete verbs and bring them in, substitute them into other words whenever we can during the editing process. In my university classes on writing, one of the quick exercises I like to do in the classroom is have every student in the class just shout out a verb. So just shout it out, and we try to go quickly through all 20, 30, 40 students. And it might go something like this. And these are, again, concrete everyday verbs. Dance, pace, score, run, turn, read, pull, twist, write, push, flip, paint, type, burn, pour, hiss, scream, see, slide, pry, show, jump, boil, cover, yell, peel, crush, cry, play, wipe, drink, greet, crunch, shout, slap, clean, climb, slip, smile. And I think by the end of listening to that really fast list going through every student in the classroom, you have a pretty good sense of what a concrete everyday verb is. On the slide, I've got some full sentence examples of concrete verb sentences. So let's look at a few of these. Mark runs past the police and jumps the fence. So the strong verbs or concrete verbs here are runs and jumps, runs and jumps. There's a nice parallel series there. The next one, Dr. Seto wrote about the viability of the project. So wrote is an everyday verb that we all understand. The next one is the police officer shouted at the protester. There can be no doubt about what the author means here, shouted. Now, if I had just had a fragment where it was the police officer at the protester, the essence of the sentence isn't there. It's all about the verb. It's all about shouting. And then finally, in academic writing, you might say something like, the study shows that the method worked. So those are all fine verbs that very few people will misunderstand as long as they have some experience in the English language. And that's instant meaning, instant communication. As well, when you're writing about, let's say, fiction or nonfiction, creative nonfiction, you may want to bring in verbs that relate to the human senses. So we have opportunities to talk about the senses in our writing as well. Not just vision, but also the other four senses. If you're writing about being at the beach, you can talk about the crashing of the waves or the squawk of the seagulls. If you're eating at a fine restaurant, you taste the heat of the spices or the fruitiness of the red wine. When you were a child, you felt things. You felt the warmth of your mother's hug, the pain of a scolding. So these are details that go beyond our typical obsession in writing with sight. So what are some verbs, for example, with smell? Well, you could use words like waft or reek or sniff, scent. For touching, we have feel, press, tickle, push, pull, punch. For ears, we have great sounds like crackle, hum, echo, scream, whisper, and groan. And then obviously for the sense of taste, we have things like lick, devour, eat, munch, gobble, and chew. Now, when I created that list, I had a lot of trouble finding verbs for smell. It's actually very hard. People often describe smells with adjectives. But the other categories have many more examples of these. So what I would suggest is go back to a previous piece of writing that you have on file and look through it and identify the verbs. See if you can see where those verbs are and make sure that they are everyday verbs that anyone, even a child, could understand. In the previous lecture, I talked about the visual nature of concrete or strong verbs, that we see them in our mind's eye right away. What about these verbs? I'm going to read a bunch of verbs out and tell me what you see in your mind. Anticipate, categorize, customize, incorporate, utilize, inculcate, vocalize, personalize. What did you see in your mind's eye? Can you see these verbs? What images, what actions spring to mind? I think you probably saw very little in your mind's eye. Most readers instead feel a vague sense of these so-called actions, but they're much more abstract than throw, run, smack. Now, these words have purposes. I don't want to say ban weak verbs, and that's what I call these verbs, often ending in ate or eyes. We can't ban them from our writing, but if we overuse them, we make our writing more difficult for readers to process. And it all has to do with that abstractness of those verbs. There's a real tendency in business writing and political writing to use these kinds of weak verbs. Now let's look at some examples on this slide. For example, the first sentence. The accountant was authorized to manipulate the numbers. Or how about, utilize the manual to understand how to administer the drug. Or, Darren formulated a plan to revolutionize the industry by anticipating next steps. As you probably noticed, and as I noticed as I was reading those out loud, they are heavier sentences. We start to feel these words weighing down on us. For example, for authorize and manipulate, you could just say allow and alter. An alternative to utilize in the second sentence is used. These are a little bit better. They're a little bit more everyday. Alternatives for formulate, as I had formulated in that third sentence, include form, design, or create. Another form of weak verb is made. Specifically, people often use the phrase that involves the words made way. And I've noticed this actually over the past few years, particularly on the news. People use this phrase instead of saying run, walk, drive. So let's look at some examples of this weak verb. The first sentence reads, Jeannie makes her way to work. Well, we could just say, Jeannie walks to work. And in most of these cases, the edit is simply to replace the weak verb with a stronger alternative. The second sentence is, Kunal made his way home to Edmonton. Well, really, I want to know how he did that. So you could say, Kunal biked home to Edmonton. Biked is a very strong verb that we all could see in our mind's eye. And then finally, the travelers faced traffic as they made their way across the city. Well, we could say the travelers faced traffic as they drove across the city. Driving means more to me in my mind's eye than made their way. Made their way really doesn't invoke any images. In the same vein is a weak verb like came. So for example, you could say something like, the sculptor came into the class. Again, like made way. We don't really know how that person came into the class. It's not visual. It's not an image. It's very generic, a generic verb. Did the sculptor, run or stumble or dash or stroll? So maybe the author could edit the sentence from the sculptor came into class to this. The sculptor stumbled into class, ricocheted across the room, and grabbed the chair for support. Now I can see those verbs. I can see stumbled. I can see ricocheted. I can see grabbed. That's instant communication with those very strong verbs. So the lesson here is simply to go back to a piece of writing and edit it to bring those weak verbs up to a strong, concrete level as often as you can. Now, you won't always be able to do this, but you need to, as with all of these editing techniques, to test your verbs. Test them. See if they are working, and see if you can come up with a simpler, more straightforward version. The worst kind of verb, and this is so common in people's writing, is the dead verb. These verbs are lifeless, and that is because they do not evoke any images or any movement in the minds of your readers, so they stop movement cold. The most common dead verb, well, that would be to be. Now, if you know from your verb conjugation, to be comes in the forms of is, are, was, were. Those are the main forms you'll see. And these get peppered throughout the writing of almost all writers at the draft stage. So before, when I said something like punch, a great concrete verb, you immediately could visualize that. If I'm in a crowded theater and I see a fire and I yell, run, everyone knows, as long as they understand English, what to do. They don't even need a full sentence. They know run means to get the heck out of that theater. But what happens if I say to you, instead of run, was, were, is, are? What do you see in your mind's eye? Well, I see nothing. It's a condition or state of being, as I defined some types of verbs earlier in the set of lectures. So sometimes we can fall back on dead verbs as a habit, and we need to get this habit out of our writing in the editing or revision process. So here are 4 sentences, and I want to show what could be done with these sentences. The boy is hungry. Well, to make this into a concrete, strong verb type of sentence, you could say something like, the boy wolfed down his first meal in 3 days. I think the verb wolfed is a really interesting one and says a lot more than is. And also we get a feeling there that he is hungry through that verb without us having to really come out and say that. And if you can show what the boy is feeling rather than just telling us he's hungry, that's great writing. Now the second one is the dog was sick. So that dead verb was. Well, we don't really know specifically the sickness, but you could say something like, the dog puked all over the white carpet. So here that strong verb puked, we all know what's going on here. And we also know the kind of higher level meaning going on with the strong verb, and that is the dog is sick. The next one, somebody might write, I was a risk taker. But what does that really mean? I mean, that's very abstract, it's very general, and it's facilitated by that dead verb. But you could say something like, all weekend I skydived and bungee jumped.
So the verbs there are skydived and bungee jumped. Those are pretty risky endeavors. And I think most people would read off that sentence with the strong verbs, the concrete verbs, to know that this person's a risk taker. They'd make that assessment. If you can let your reader do the judgments for you, you're involving them in the writing process, the reading process, rather than telling them the person was a risk taker. And then finally, for example, somebody could say the concept was difficult. So was is our dead verb. Well, you could say something like the concept stumped students and scholars alike. So in all the 4 revised versions, I think we immediately see those actions instead of the dead verb versions. So far, I've been dealing with examples that sound like they're coming from fiction or creative nonfiction, but you could also apply this to academia. You can say something like, in this example, someone writes, the idea of community was growing in the minds of writers in the 1920s, so the dead verb there is was. In this case, was causes us to take a dead verb further and add ing on a very strong root. So the word grow is a nice, concrete, everyday verb, but it's shackled with those ing endings. So the revision of this, well, you could say the idea of community grew in the minds of writers in the 1920s. That places the emphasis on the verb and not was or the ing. Some other examples of dead verbs, the verb could. I often see this in people's writing. They say something like, I sat in the forest with my binoculars. I looked around for the rare black and white woodpecker. I could hear its distinctive pecks on a nearby tree. So here, could distracts from the verb hear. If you just say, I hear its distinctive pecks, that's the same thing. And it focuses the mind in the reader on the hearing, not the could. Another example, my uncle has a dog, could be revised to something like, my uncle owns a dog. Or the boys had a plan. You could just change it to the boys created a plan. I think created is a little bit better. Not as strong as run through or hit, but you'll find alternatives are not always that simple. So some people ask me whether editing these verbs, changing verbs from abstract to concrete or from dead to concrete really makes a big difference. And I argue it does for 2 reasons. So there are some greater consequences to using a lot of these either weak or dead verbs in your writing. One is the tendency to generalize. Dead verbs like to be, is, was, were, are, they allow us to just generalize. They let us off the hook for having to make very detailed meaning for our readers. And second, there's often a lack of movement in the plot or the exposition if you're writing an essay. I can look across a piece of document, and if I see lots of dead verbs, I can already tell there's a problem here with either that generalization or that movement. So on the point of generalization, imagine if I wrote something like, my father was angry. So here we have the dead verb was, and we have the adjective angry, but I am one step removed in this sentence from the real anger of this person's father. I don't feel it. I don't experience it. It's like a summary of anger. So how could you fix this? And again, it involves just turning back to concrete verbs. Imagine this scene about the father. My father took the phone from his ear and threw it against the wall. He slammed his fist down on the table and screamed. So here we get to feel anger of this father, rather than the summary version, which was my father was angry. In the detailed version, use a lot of concrete verbs. That is anger. So that's how you could convert generalization to specificity. Now, the second point about stopping action, the overuse of those verbs puts more emphasis on conditions or states of being, as I described in the definition of a verb earlier in these lectures. So dead verbs, inherently focusing on conditions or states of being, stop action. They eliminate action. That's inherent in those words. So let's look at an example of a paragraph full of dead verbs. So read this slide through. You might want to pause it, and then I'll discuss it. So the issue here in this paragraph is not grammar or spelling. It's simply a poor style with dead verbs. There's nothing happening here. It's a summary of feelings and actions, but we need to get those
concrete verbs in it. And this is the revised version. So I'll let you pause this video and read through the revised version of this story with Samir and Andrea. So I think you can see in the revised version there I've simply added in strong verbs where the dead verbs were, and they become the focus. They start to move things along. Things happen to these characters. It's not a summary anymore, it's real life. I'm right there in the room with these people. I'm not kind of feeling distant from them. It's much more detailed. Now, some students ask me, wow, this is great for fiction or creative nonfiction. Can you do this in academic writing or business writing? Well, of course you can. It's a little bit harder because we don't often use strong verbs in academic writing. We don't say throw, hit, run, walk in our academic papers or our business writing. But for example, you could say something like, the two scholars were in agreement. That might come up in any kind of writing. Or you could change it to the two scholars agreed. And agreed is a pretty strong verb. Now imagine this one in a communications essay. Marshall McLuhan was the inventor of the terms hot and cold media. Not a bad sentence. It's not awful. But it has a dead verb. So we could say something like, Marshall McLuhan invented the terms hot and cold media. Invented, again, is not as strong as run or throw or walk. It doesn't necessarily evoke in our minds the same images, but I think it's better than the deadest verb, which is was. In academic or business writing, you may have to search a little bit harder to find concrete verbs. And some of them might be things like affirms or argues, articulates, asserts, attacks, claims, offers, hints, thinks, shows, confirms, champions, celebrates, denounces, mocks, allows, confesses. So there are some options there for writing that is not necessarily rooted in the everyday world as fiction or creative nonfiction often is. So go back to your writing with these ideas in mind and just make sure that you're moving your pieces of writing in whatever genre along with concrete verbs. And it might be as simple as crossing out that dead verb and dropping in a strong one. It can be helpful to think of your sentences as icebergs. So that tip of the iceberg is semantic meaning. So that is just the pure meaning of those words that you put on the page. So if you say something like, Jacob threw the baseball, well, most readers will process that in a very simple way, and they'll get the meaning of the individual doing the action, which is the throwing, and the receiver of that action is the ball. That's as far as most readers process. But back to that iceberg example, as we know, there's so much more under the water, so to speak, in an iceberg. There's just so much below that. And if we think of what's below the water line, metaphorically speaking, as your underlying grammatical structure of your sentences, we can actually harness what's going on underneath the pure meaning of your sentences for clarity, for more effective writing, writing that gets to the point, writing that is direct, writing that ultimately readers, editors quite enjoy. So in this set of lectures, we're going to look at the difference between two word orders. So that's the way you put the words in some sort of order. So the English language does allow us to move things around in a sentence. For example, adverbs can go in so many different locations. Adjectives usually go before nouns, these kinds of things. Well, we can also see that there are two opposing, you might call them, structures of sentences, orders of sentences, and those are called the active voice and the passive voice. For these lectures, I'm particularly interested in helping you to get passive voice out of your writing most of the time. So I'm saying 95% of the time. And as a result, when you do this, when you convert your passive voice sentences to active voice, you will write better, I promise you. And readers will enjoy your writing. In the introduction of these lectures, I mentioned word order. So this awful thing that I'm going to describe in this set of lectures called passive voice is a certain kind of word order. So you're putting the words in a different and often long-winded order compared to what's called active voice. Don't let the voice part confuse you. I think it should be called, and it's not in grammatical terms, but I think it should be called just active order, passive order. Now, in passive voice, the order of the words becomes a little bit longer than in active voice. It can often be incomplete. It can be evasive. And I'm going to show you what all these things are all about as we go through these lectures. And this is probably the only really in-depth grammar knowledge that you really need to write well. This is as deep as it needs to get to understand how to put interesting, direct, useful sentences together. If you can figure this out, if you can get this, you don't really have to worry about all the other things in the grammar book. So let's begin with explaining what these word orders are. So I want to begin with active voice. So active voice is the ideal word order sentence. So on the slide, you'll see a little bit of a diagram here or an equation of some sort, as if we were doing mathematics. And the simplest active voice sentence, and this is the simplest sentence you can produce in the English language, simply is a subject and a verb. So that's the first simplest active voice sentence. So it could be things like Joe talked, Richie painted, Kylie ran, Ariana sang. Very simple, 1, 2, 1, 2. And those verbs that I mentioned in those 4 sentences, they all don't require anything else. So what is the subject of the sentence? Well, as you saw in these active voice sentences, the subject is essentially a doer. I mean, it's a very awkward word, but it's the best I can come up with. And that is the doer of whatever the action is in the verb that comes after. And that's the key thing. We get the verb after the person or thing that is doing the action has been mentioned. So we know who the individual or thing is first, and then we get the action. Now, the second type of active voice sentence is a little bit more complicated, but still very simple. And you'll see on the slide another equation. And so another type of active voice sentence simply has a subject, a verb, which you've already seen, and then what's called a direct object. So think of this as the direct receiver of whatever action you are describing in that verb. So we have a thing or a person doing an action onto something else. That object, in grammatical terms, could be human, could be a thing. Doesn't really matter. They're just receiving whatever that action is. Some examples of the second or longer type of active voice sentence include the dog broke the door. Carrie straddled the fence. Clouds blanket the sky. He grabs the suitcase. Cyclists circled the track. So in all these cases, we have a doer, which is the subject of the sentence. We have a nice action, a very strong verb there. And then something else. And that is the object. That's the receiver of the action in all those examples. So that's active voice. Very straightforward, very simple. You can write 95% of your sentences in this way. But I think more importantly, you'll start to think more logically and more straightforward. Think more clearly when you are thinking about constructing your sentences with a doer right away, right at the head of the sentence, and then the verb after. So I've already given you the equation for active voice. Well, what does the equation for passive voice look like? Well, it's much more complicated. And that really shows the problem with passive voice. That to write in passive voice, you must introduce some new parts of speech, some new parts of grammar, just to make the same meaning. So let's look at these parts. So first you've got the direct object. So that's the receiver of the action. As we saw in active voice, the receiver usually comes at the end of a simple active voice sentence. Well, here it's at the beginning. So that's the first strange thing about passive voice word order, and that is the receiver comes first. Then we've got what's called a dead verb, to be, some form of to be,
Was, were, is, or are. This is a useless word that doesn't say anything, that doesn't have any images. Then we need what's called a participle form of a verb. So if you remember back to your conjugation of verbs class in school, you'll know that verbs have different endings. They take on different forms based on the subject, based on a whole number of factors, including number itself, plural or singular, past or present tense. Well, the participle form of a verb is a strange, often irregular form. So if we think of words like broken or stolen or thrown or beaten, these are not forms of those verbs that we use that often. We don't say, I stolen the shoes. We say, I stole the shoes, or she stole the shoes, not stolen. So these are irregular and not often used, but they're required in passive voice. And then the fourth part of the equation for passive voice structure or word order is the optional preposition. And I say optional because in a lot of passive voice sentences, this does not exist. So there is no preposition. A preposition here is obviously by. And then finally, the optional subject. So in active voice, the subject or the doer of the action came first. In passive voice, it comes at the end of the sentence, and it can be optional. So that is a key point to remember as I go through these lectures, that we do not have to say the doer of the action. So what are some examples of passive voice sentences? Well, we could say something like, the winner was named by the awards committee. The fence was straddled by Carrie. The message is sent by the computer. The CEO was chosen by the organization. The dog was bitten by William. So in all these cases, the receiver of the action, the naming, the straddling, the sending, the choosing, and the biting all come first. And we've had to introduce more words. So you'll notice these sentences are longer than the typical active voice subject, verb, object sentence. So they inherently introduce wordiness. And they make us wait, a suspenseful wait for the doer of the action. In English, this comes across as somewhat illogical to readers because we're getting the receiver of the action first. We don't even know the action until the second word, and we don't even know the doer of the action till the end. And as I said, those can be optional. So we could simply say, the winner was named, the fence was straddled, the message is sent, the CEO was chosen, the dog was bitten. But if I say those things and I avoid the optional by preposition and the doer of the action, we as readers are missing information. We want to know. We want to know who did the naming, the straddling, the sending, the choosing, the biting. That's important information, but that can be left out and it's still a grammatical sentence. Having seen these equations, you might think that the difference between active and passive is a simple reversal of the sentences. Well, of course, the passive equation is not simply a reversal because it's got additional elements that are required by the grammar to make meaning. And also sometimes what is the passive part of a sentence is not the whole sentence. So just remember that, not the whole sentence necessarily. I'll give you an example. Imagine in this sentence, in active voice, we say, Laura invited Nancy to a party this Saturday night. Now, the whole part of that sentence is not that important to us. We're only interested in a little bit of it. It would be incorrect to kind of flip it and say, hey, I've got passive voice. For example, if somebody flipped the sentence and said, to a party this Saturday night, Laura invited Nancy. That is not passive voice because the doer of the action is still coming first. So Laura is still coming first, and then we're getting that verb invited, and we're still getting the object or the receiver of the action, Nancy, she's being invited, at the end of that sentence. So that's still active voice. So if you want to convert this to passive, I don't know why you would want to, but if you want to convert this to passive just to see what's going on here, you would write something like, Nancy was invited by Laura to a party this Saturday night. So that little construction, Laura invited Nancy, becomes converted to Nancy was invited by Laura. 5 words when the original in active voice was 3. So that's the inherent wordiness that comes with passive voice. Now, it's important to understand how this under the surface, this bit of the iceberg under the surface works, because when you're editing your work or the work of other people, you will want to, in 95% of the cases, convert the passive voice examples into active voice. We call this conversion. So on the slide, I've got a number of passive voice sentences. And what I would like you to do is pause this video and sit down with a pen and paper, write those passive sentences down, and convert them to active voice. If you're having any trouble converting these, or you're not sure about maybe other examples that you're coming across, please post questions to me in the forums of this set of lectures. So far, I've given you the grammar that's kind of under the surface of sentences, and I've given you an example of a very straightforward style of word order, which is active voice, and then also a problematic kind because of wordiness and some unusual constructions, and that is passive voice or passive word order. But these are kind of technical points. What about greater issues of passive voice? And one I want to talk about is the idea of the morality of passive voice. So this is a greater issue that sometimes people use passive voice to avoid responsibility. Let me give you an example. On the slide, this sentence says, "The village was bombed and 7 children were killed." So these are reprehensible actions. Killing children, bombing a village. But if you go through this sentence, and it's a passive voice sentence, you'll realize what's missing. What is that? The doer of the actions of bombing and killing. We don't have the doer. This is passive voice. We've got the receivers of the actions, the village, the 7 children. We've got the to be forms of the verbs, was and were. We've got the participle form of the verb, bombed and killed. So all the elements are there, the required elements of passive voice, but we're missing the optional by whoever, by the doer of these actions. And this can be deliberate. So a lot of writers, political writers, will avoid doing this. Business writers will avoid writing in active voice so that they can just not have to take responsibility for this. Now, what would you do with this kind of a sentence? Well, you would say government planes bombed the village and killed 7 children. That's the active voice version because the doer of the action comes first. Now, another one, in this slide, you'll see an example of a business letter that tries to evade responsibility. This is a termination notice. And notice that the writer says, "Please note that your position in the company has been eliminated." That's passive voice because we don't know who did the eliminating. They say no other position has been found. Well, who was doing the finding? We don't know. And then also the severance package stuff will be sent to your home address by whom? I don't know. So really there's 3 sentences there missing the 3 doers of these major actions. This is pretty serious stuff. In business writing, people will write this way often to avoid having a target on their back for these actions. So if you know who did the firing, you can contact that person and lay into them about this firing or find out why. But if we write in the passive voice, we don't even have to do that. And that's a problem. In academia, you sometimes get passive voice because people want to seem objective. So in science, they'll say something like this in a report: "A limited sample was taken and tentative conclusions were drawn." So scientists want to think they are objective, so they write in passive voice all the time. You see this in other kinds of academic writing across all kinds of fields. But really it's not. Human beings did those samples, took those samples. The human beings drew the conclusions. And so they're trying to hide behind a kind of faux objectivity, a pseudo-objectivity using passive voice. And that's a problem. A final good example comes in politics. So politicians will say, "Your taxes will be raised." But they'll never say in the active voice, "I will raise your taxes," for obvious reasons. Now, they will speak in the active voice when it's something that they want to get credit for, such as, "I will lower your taxes." They would never say something in passive voice like, "Your taxes will be lowered," because that's not giving them the credit. We should recognize this morality of passive voice and make sure that we're not using these wordy constructions to hide our responsibility for actions. We should come out and be honest and be direct and state that we are the doer of these actions. That respects the people on the receiving end of this kind of communication.
Earlier in this set of lectures, I said that you should use active voice 95% of the time. And the reason I put that qualification on it is because there are times when passive voice is more suitable for what you're trying to say. And as long as you're not doing it to hide something or to avoid something, then it's totally fine to use that. So let me give you a few examples. Let's say you want to emphasize the receiver of an action on purpose. At the start of a sentence, you could write something like, the Confederation Bridge was opened in 1997. What's the active voice version of that? Something like, the government officials opened the Confederation Bridge in 1997, because they're the doers of the action. But really, we're focusing on the bridge. We don't need to know. I mean, if some random officials were involved in this, that's not important to the sentence. So we can use passive voice there. We can avoid saying who the doers were. Another one, if you remember this invention a few years ago, the Segway, a personal vehicle, was introduced in 2001. Again, we want to emphasize the receiver of the action, the object, that's the Segway. And it's perfectly fine to say that. We don't have to say who introduced it. Even though we do know who the inventor was, Dean Kamen invented it. You could say Dean Kamen introduced the Segway, a personal vehicle, in 2001. That's the active voice version. But that would only be useful if you were trying to focus on Dean Kamen. If you're trying to focus on the Segway, there's no need to say who did the introducing. Another situation comes if you really don't know who did the action. So a lot of journalists face this problem in their writing. So for example, remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? The journalist on that day did not know who did it, and there have been movies since questioning just who was the shooter of JFK. So naturally, the person would need to write in passive voice and say something like, American President John F. Kennedy was assassinated today in Dallas. And of course, we want to emphasize the president at the start of the sentence. Now, that does raise questions. Who did it? And that was something the police had to find out. Another common passive voice sentence is just one that we use all the time, and that is something like, Sandra was born in 1983. So in that case, Sandra is the receiver of the action of bearing, and really the doer of the action is her mother. We wouldn't want to convert this to active voice. We wouldn't want to say, Sandra's mother bore her in 1983, because it sounds stupid. It sounds weird. It's just unusual to our ears. And certainly that is a test in all kinds of writing, is does it sound right to our ears? So we would always say Sandra was born in 1983. So those are a few examples of exceptions when you can break the rule. But I would say be cautious. Test your passive cases, your passive sentences. Determine, do they really need to be passive, or can I make them active voice and strengthen my writing and be more direct? The most important word in a sentence is the verb. The second most important word in a sentence is the noun. So what is a noun? Well, you'll remember from your grade 3 English class, it's a person, place, or thing. So while verbs are kind of the muscle of writing, nouns are really the bones of writing. And most importantly, nouns can create detailed images in the reader's mind. So immediate images, if you choose the right nouns. Just like verbs, some nouns are strong nouns and some nouns are weak nouns. So you want to get as many strong nouns into your writing as possible. And in this set of lectures, I'll show you how to do that. I'm also going to show you in this set of lectures a problem that often comes up, and that is the pronoun, the unclear pronoun. And pronouns simply replace nouns, and sometimes we can overdo it with the pronouns, and sometimes we can't understand just what that pronoun is actually referring to. And that creates concern, it annoys readers, and we need to make sure in most cases we're using strong nouns and not unclear or vague pronouns. And indeed, most good writing is extremely detailed. So this kind of technique, concern for nouns, helps you add that detail that readers absolutely enjoy.
Let's now look at the images that certain kinds of nouns can create in your reader's mind. And these are instantaneous images, instant communication by using certain nouns. So on the slide, the first noun is city. And what do we see in our mind's eye when we encounter this noun, city? What about the noun dog? What comes to our mind? And what about car? What comes to your mind when I say the noun car? Well, generally, most of us come up with some general images of cities, dogs, cars from our personal experience, the cities we've been to, the dogs we've owned, the cars we've driven. But let's look at what happens when you upgrade these nouns. I call these weak nouns. Let's upgrade them to another level of detail. What if we have the noun New York? Well, in our mind's eye, most of us have at some point, whether we've not even visited New York, we know what New York looks like from so many pictures, from the big events that have happened in New York City in our lifetimes. We can imagine that city right away. And that's really powerful detail. If you invoke the word New York, there's no explaining you have to do. You do not have to describe New York to your readers. Now, instead of dog, let's say collie. What do we see with collie? Well, this kind of animal, that's very different than the generic dog that we saw on a previous slide. You could put Chihuahua in there and most people would see that tiny little dog as well. And I'm sure there are a lot of other breeds of dogs that would spark a really strong image in the reader's mind. And then finally, instead of car, what if we invoke the very strong noun Ferrari? Well, right away we see that car. And I think we often see in our mind's eye red Ferraris. That's just the icon of the Ferrari brand is the red car. So those are three examples of how you can upgrade your nouns to something stronger, to create that photographic image, and you want to make pictures with your writing. And strong nouns do that. They add detail, they add pictures, they add images so easily without needing to explain to the reader what the thing or the object or the person looks like. An important kind of strong noun is the name. So certainly in fiction, there are so many great names of famous characters and they stick in our minds. So let's think of some of those. For example, Jay Gatsby, Romeo and Juliet, Pippi Longstocking, Captain Ahab, Harry Potter, Gollum, Big Brother, Lemuel Gulliver, Huck Finn. These are really unique names, and right away they remind us of that story. Maybe we read it as a child, maybe we read it recently, and it also creates a lot of feelings surrounding those characters. So names are very powerful. And make sure that you get names, whether it's fiction, whether you're doing nonfiction, such as journalism, whether you're doing business writing or academic writing even, get names into your sentences. Another way to get nouns into your writing is to appeal to the senses. So in a previous set of lectures, I talked about how verbs can appeal to the 5 human senses, while strong nouns do the same. So on the slide, I've listed some strong nouns categorized by sense. So first we have the sense of sight. And some nouns are like shine, luster, glow, gleam, flash, view. What about the sense of smell? Well, you've got so many in this area. Just a few are stink, stench, odor, aroma, fragrance. How about touch? Well, there's punch, hit, slap, wallop, tap, pressure. For the sense of hearing, you've got nouns like snap, crack, pop, knock, squeal, burp, bang. And these are so much fun to read out loud as I'm telling you these. And then finally, the sense of taste. There's zest, flavor, palate, salt, sugar, nibble. So when you're writing any kind of writing, not just fiction, but also creative nonfiction, even journalism, think about getting some of these senses into your nouns.
In a previous lecture, I talked about how there are weak nouns and then there are upgraded nouns. We can call those strong nouns. In some business writing and academic writing, there's often another kind of weak noun. We could almost call it a dead noun, like dead verbs. And these are nouns that have tion suffixes. So at the end of the word or the root of the noun, they've got tion. So whenever you find yourself putting tion on a noun, stop for a second and think about it. You may have a really strong noun, but you are actually hurting it by adding that long ending. Now, sometimes these nouns are just at the root not very good nouns. They don't provide any images. So let's look at some of these tion nouns on the slide. So here we've got formulation, hesitation, indentation, argumentation, installation, mediation, observation, operation, publication, recitation, separation, confrontation, allocation, adaptation. As I'm reading that, they all sound the same because of the shun at the end, the tion. It just comes across as generic. It comes across as very similar. Now, one thing to remember is while these have uses, so there are times when you want to say mediation. We're going to mediation. We are going to have an adaptation of that movie or something like that. Those are fine, but in moderation. Some people use these kinds of nouns way too much, and they can weigh down sentences and paragraphs. Sometimes there are better options. So don't always think that you have to use these words. We just need to kind of look for alternatives. So here are 6 examples that I'm going to show you on the slide of sentences that have that tion suffix on them, on the key noun in the sentence. So the first one is, Arthur's recitation of the speech was wonderful. The second one, the boy had a confrontation with his parents that evening. Alice created the indentation in the wall. The lawyers were successful at mediation between the two parties. The couple's separation occurred at the end of the year. The CEO had an observation of falling share prices. Now, these aren't the worst sentences in the world, but I think we can make them even better by getting back to the essence of these sentences. The actions in each case, so whether that's the reciting, the confronting, the indenting, the mediating, the separating, or the observing, they all seem kind of distant. We didn't experience these actions in the moment that they occurred. It's almost like an after-the-fact mention of these actions in the form of nouns. Now, readers love to experience actions that seem to happen in the very moment they're reading them, as if they're standing right there with the writer as the events in the writing actually unfold. But in these cases, some very strong verbs like recite or confront have become really dead nouns. So how do you fix this? Well, how about we just convert those tion nouns back to the verbs that they come from. So for example, you could say, Arthur recited the speech wonderfully. The boy confronted his parents that evening. Alice indented the wall. The lawyers successfully mediated the two parties. The couple separated at the end of the year. The CEO observed the falling share prices. I think these revised sentences of converting nouns to verbs work better. They let us directly experience the actions that were a bit distant in the long, dead noun form. And also they avoid wordiness, so these are tighter sentences. They've been edited a bit. They're shorter. They get to the point. So my advice to you is simply to consider whether you truly need these long tion nouns in your writing. If you don't, try revising them and getting back to the root verb, as I've done here. I think your readers will appreciate being more directly involved in the actions that you're describing. Grammatically speaking, the companion to the noun, the counterpoint to the noun, is the pronoun. Now, a pronoun simply replaces a noun. We use these when we don't want to repeat the noun, because sometimes over repetition of a noun can be grating on the reader. It can be annoying. So we throw in words like I, you, he, she, they, their, them, themselves, we, our, us, it, itself, me, mine, myself, him, his, her, one, himself, herself. These are just different forms, different types of pronouns replacing what are often strong nouns. Pronouns are fine as long as they're not overused and as long as what's called a pronoun reference is very clear.
So what is a pronoun reference in grammar terms? Well, that's simply the idea that the pronoun is very closely located after the noun that it's referring to. So if you drew a line backwards from the pronoun, you would not too far behind that pronoun find the noun that it refers to. We need a very tight relationship between the noun and the pronoun. So for example, here are some sentences on the slide that show a very tight relationship. The team traded its greatest player. John grabbed his wallet and left. The cyclists rode their bikes to the race. The president reserved his question for later. There is no misunderstanding here as to what those pronouns refer to because the noun came so soon before that pronoun arrived on the scene. There's a very small gap there. But remember, using a pronoun requires the reader to hold in their brains, in their minds, the noun for a little bit, hopefully just a little bit, before they get that pronoun and they make that mental connection. Now here's a sentence where that pronoun reference is very, very clear. Marion crashed her car. She was not hurt in the crash. The ambulance took her to the hospital. Her daughter Kylie rushed over to see her. So there's no confusion. Her clearly means Marion in the first sentence. She obviously refers to Marion because that's the only woman that we've come across so far. And the her in the next sentence obviously refers to Marion. And then her again refers to Marion. Then we have another name, a noun, Kylie, in the sentence. But of course, none of those pronouns refer to Kylie here. So that's fine. That's a great sentence. It's clear. It's straightforward. A big problem in writing, however, comes when this pronoun antecedent relationship, which is the noun, an antecedent simply means what comes before, breaks down. So that's when we don't know what the noun is that this pronoun is actually referring to. So for example, let me give you this sentence. Sally and Mary spent the night at her house. So when we think about what the antecedent is, so that's what noun comes before this pronoun, well, the first thing we think is it's probably Mary because she's the closest person to the her pronoun. But it could actually be Sally. Maybe it's Sally's house. So how do you correct this? And how do you correct any ambiguity in a pronoun-noun reference? Well, why don't you just drop the noun back in? So you could say Sally and Mary spent the night at Sally's house. Another example is somewhat humorous, this problem with pronouns, and that is Napoleon sat on the horse Napoleon Jr. just after losing the war and wondered how much Josephine loved him. So what's the joke here? Well, that final pronoun him could refer to essentially two nouns, whether that's Napoleon or Napoleon Jr. And since Napoleon Jr. is actually the closest noun to him, we could say that Josephine is in a kind of love triangle with Napoleon, the human being, and a horse. This may seem far-fetched, but a lot of times when we have these pronoun antecedent problems, there are these points of laughter, points of jokes because of that unclear pronoun. So what would you do with that? Well, you could simply change it to Napoleon sat on the horse Napoleon Jr. just after losing the war. Napoleon wondered how much Josephine loved him. Here, there is no joke. It's him referring backwards to Napoleon. There's another problem with this pronoun antecedent situation, and that is when we use the generalized they. They is a pronoun meaning plural. It means multiple people or things. So you could say, for example, in Newfoundland, they used to have a lot of fish. Or when someone breaks a bone, they have to have a cast put on. So in both of these sentences, if you draw an arrow back from they to find the noun, well, you have a problem. You have a grammatical problem of number. So Newfoundland, in the first example, which is before that pronoun they, is singular. So there's only one Newfoundland, yet the pronoun is plural. So that's a grammatical problem. And in the second sentence, someone is a singular human being, And they is plural. So if you draw the arrow back from they, you do not have a noun, for example, and you also have another pronoun that is actually singular, someone. So why does this matter? Why does this really specific pronoun antecedent thing cause any consternation for people? Well, it's not a huge problem, but if you're doing this a lot in your writing, readers have trouble following you. And if they're having trouble following you, they're losing faith in you as a writer. So it's not that your sentences are awful. It's not that they're falling apart, the way a car might be falling apart if it's breaking down, but there's something loose in the sentence. It takes away from clarity. It takes away from the sense of reliability of the sentence and the writer. Also, a lot of times people use pronouns right at the start of a sentence. So I've argued in a previous lecture that we should always start sentences with the doer of an action. So she did this, they did that, John did this, whatever. But sometimes people start sentences like this. It was an unparalleled boxing match at the arena tonight. There were many fans of the singer. It is an awful night for a wedding proposal. Well, if you try to draw your line back from those pronouns to find the noun, you have nothing. Because actually, in the first and third sentences, the noun that the pronoun's referring to is actually after. And that's a problem. We have to wait to encounter what the noun is. And then there were, we have a pronoun there that has no antecedent, and we have also a dead verb, were. So how could you edit this? Well, you could just say something like the boxing match at the arena tonight was unparalleled. You could also say the singer had many fans. You could also say the night is awful for a wedding proposal. So those are some very simple ways, moving the doers of the action to the head of the sentence, to the start of the sentence, so we don't have these unclear or vague pronouns. So keep this pronoun lesson in mind, and when you're going back and editing your work, look for those pronouns and just make sure that reference is very tight to the noun. Make sure there is a noun before that. If you want to change things, drop in a noun again and replace that pronoun and make it easier on the reader. I think also this lesson can help you to see your sentences in a relational sense, that words relate to other words in sentences. And this I for pronoun reference, pronoun antecedent reference can help you develop that sense of objective editing of your sentences. Being an original writer, that is expressing new, fresh ideas in a voice that is uniquely yours, is very difficult, particularly if you're a beginning writer. Many new writers tend to bend under the weight of literary, cultural influences. They like to emulate the styles of other writers. Sometimes they even copy exact phrasings, as we see with plagiarism in university and college papers. Sometimes those beginning writers draw on old sayings passed down from their grandparents and their grandparents' parents. Essentially, they copy ideas. Now, contrary to what you might think, original language, original writing is not language that's never been written or spoken before. That is impossible. We share a language, we share a culture. We have to use the common linguistic resources that we have to make meaning. Without those common linguistic resources, we wouldn't be able to communicate at all. Writing just cannot be an individual task without any influence at all. So the writer, that imaginary great writer who seems unaffected by his or her culture, doesn't exist. So I define originality in a different way. You can be original within limits of your culture and your language, but I think of originality as frequency. So words that circulate frequently are too familiar, so they do not feel fresh and original. But infrequently used language looks and sounds interesting. Your readers won't have seen it before on the page, or at least not that often. So this idea of frequent versus infrequent should guide you as a writer, because readers, particularly teachers and editors, delight in original language. And I think most of you know that feeling of encountering a less frequent word or phrase. When you hear someone say something in a way you haven't heard before, you enjoy it.
And then sometimes you go and borrow it and you use it in your own conversation because language is social. It changes, it adapts. Language we accept as the norm today is often language that was very fresh and new decades ago. Think of these words and phrases and how popular and frequent they are. Totally awesome. Bling. Dude. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. All of these, what we know as common, frequent language over the last 10, 20 years, probably excited people when it was first heard. That's why people use that language, so it became unoriginal. Now, when you say something like bling, it's almost ironic in a sense. You're not using it in an original way. So like a viral video on YouTube, certain words and phrases have passed from person to person, year after year, until they become widely known and part of our linguistic and cultural heritage. And the media plays a part in this, obviously, circulating those phrases and words to wide audiences. But sometimes it becomes a little too easy to borrow that language that everyone else is using and put together sentences in a cliched way. And that's what this set of lectures is all about, and that is the cliche. We can think of cliches in a lot of fields. A cliche in fashion is something that's not cool anymore. Imagine someone coming today wearing the old 1960s tie-dye clothes. Those are cliche clothes. There's certain haircuts are cliche, and also words. So simply a cliche is a word or phrase that has become unoriginal through overuse. And I think what you need to do as writers, develop that recognition of hot and cold language. So language that is hot is stuff that's being overused, and cool or cold language is stuff that still seems fresh because it hasn't been overused. It's not worn out. If you can recognize those cliches, you can get them out of your writing. The first way to be an original writer is to recognize the cliches within your culture, within your field, within the audience that you're writing for. If you have too many cliches in your writing, some readers will actually tune out. Certainly well-educated readers will tune out of your writing completely. So what are cliches? What do they look like? Well, many cliches are passed down sayings from generation to generation. Sometimes we've forgotten that they have a history. In my writing classes, I'll often ask students to tell me the meaning or the origins behind the cliche, once in a blue moon. So let's say I put that in a sentence like, he cleans his room once in a blue moon. Now we know once in a blue moon is a very common cliche. It's a well-worn phrase. It doesn't have any originality at all. And we know intuitively in the English language that cliche means he cleans his room infrequently. But what's the blue moon part all about? Now I had to look this up. I didn't know what blue moon really meant. So if you look it up on the cliche sites, and you can go to websites and find cliches, it is simply when you get 2 full moons in the same month. And it has nothing to do with being blue. So this cosmic rarity happens only about every 28 to 30 months. That's why we get that feeling that it's a rare event. But I had to look that up. So what culture would have produced this metaphor? Well, it's not our digital age. We don't even look at the moon much anymore. We're more rooted in our computers. Instead, the once in a blue moon cliche would have been rooted in a natural world where farmers took a key interest in the changes in our environment, the sun, the moon. Now, our lives today don't depend on these factors anymore, so our cliches would not be born out of the natural world. They would perhaps be born out of the computer world. So now on the slide, I'm going to list a bunch of cliches, and I want you to fill in the blanks. Let's see how fast we can do this. It's raining cats in. Don't bite the hand that. She's as free as a... He's a pain in the... Last but not, the princess lived happily. His daughter was the apple of... Still waters run. You should walk a mile in my... His back was against the... I'm sure you could fill in those fairly easily. And that's because these are just such common phrases. They are so unoriginal that you could actually know the end of the sentence without me actually telling you. And you don't want your readers to know where you're going before they even get to the end of the sentence. Now here are some longer cliche sentences. See if you can pick out the cliches. We are sick and tired of the tried and true approach to office management and are seeking a breath of fresh air from the new plan. It was raining cats and dogs, but we slept like logs through the storm. She stopped dead in her tracks. Lying on the floor was her son, crying his eyes out. I get a kick out of seeing you have a whale of a good time. The naked truth is that he's the ace in the hole for the company. So I've made these up, but these kinds of cliches get used very often. Finally, let's look at a few phrases and words that are cliche now that remind us of a different era. If I say to you, we're going to be talking jive, or everything's very groovy, you probably think of the 1960s and 1970s. The cliche word awesome reminds me at least of the 1980s. The phrase my bad, if you grew up in the US or Canada in the 1990s, you probably heard that a lot. Now, most of us don't use these phrases that much anymore because they've kind of died off a bit. And if you use them, it might be as a joke. So in this lecture, I've given you a basic appreciation of cliches, well-worn phrases. Now it's your turn to develop your eye for finding these, because of course I can't list them all. I mentioned in this lecture there are cliche sites. You can go to those websites and look around and search for some cliches if you're not sure exactly what is a cliche. Also, you need to read widely. So if you want to become a great writer, the start of that is to read. Read the kind of writing that you want to produce at a high quality. So, for example, if you're interested in creative nonfiction, I would suggest reading a magazine like The New Yorker. There are no cliches in The New Yorker. There's a lot of originality. And if you're reading that kind of material regularly, then you will intuitively understand what is fresh in culture today, in language today. So if cliches are so bad, why do we still see them? We even see them in the mainstream media. We see politicians using them. We see journalists. How do they slip into other people's writing? Well, first of all, one could be a lack of awareness. So if you don't know what's a cliche, then of course you're going to use them in your newspaper articles, your websites, your blogs, your books. If you're not reading the works of other people in whatever area you enjoy, high quality writers, you won't know what words and phrases have reached that status, that high point of frequency as a cliche. Also, if you are not born in a English-speaking or Western country or culture, you may not recognize some phrases you hear or use as cliches. Now, if you're born here, you probably recognize it, as I have been born in a Western country, English-speaking country. But if you're new to the West, you're new to English, you may not recognize that because you're totally new to this. But in your own language, in your own culture that you were born into, I'm sure there are cliches as well, but they might be a little different than the ones we use. Cliches are often used also as an easy way out. Writing is difficult work. It's challenging to be original. It's challenging to come up with a new way of saying something. It's much easier to just string together a bunch of cliches. And there are some newspapers, popular newspapers. In my city, there's a newspaper called the Toronto Sun, and it's riddled with cliches. If you're at the checkout line of the department store or the drugstore, you will probably see a lot of magazines, cheap magazines for fashion and entertainment that are full of cliches because it's just so easy to write that kind of material, and they're not trying to be a high-level magazine or newspaper. Also, some journalists, particularly in those populist newspapers, feel their audiences don't really care about using cliches. And of course, when you use a cliche, it's often quick, easy meaning. They think that some of their audience members respond favorably to cliches, and that may be true, but not everybody's that way. And certainly great editors, great writers know that that's a problem. Finally, there's actually some writers who believe that it's stylish to use cliches. It's cool to use cliches. I call those people the egotistical stylists. They are emphasizing the form of what they're saying, the popularity of that form over the substance of what they're saying. So look back to your previous writing, maybe take a piece of writing that you wrote last year or a few months ago, and look around, see if you've got cliches. And try to edit them out. Try to change them. This is going to be challenging. It's hard work to be original, but it's important to be able to recognize these cliches popping up in your writing. Now, I've spent this set of lectures railing against the cliche, encouraging you to be original, but there are times when it is okay to use the cliche. So what are those cases? Well, first of all, let's think of dialogue in a fiction novel. So sometimes in stories, cliches help to create realistic dialogue of a specific period of time in our history. Perhaps your grandmother loves to say the cliche phrase, "A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush." In a story about your grandmother, you wouldn't edit this sentence because that's the way she typically speaks. She's from a different time when that was a cool phrase, an interesting phrase. Maybe she encountered it as a child when it was original. Now, second, you can use cliches to create an atmosphere of the past, of a particular time or era. So if you want to establish the atmosphere in a story of a high school cafeteria in the 1980s, then you want to bring in the cliches that belong to that 1980s period. If you want to establish the atmosphere of a factory assembly line, then I'm sure there are cliches that belong to that scene that'll help you capture that feeling well. Hairdressing salons, children's sandboxes, a chemistry class at university, an athletic locker room. There are cliches in all of those spaces now and also in the past. The third time that cliches are okay is when you are playing with them. So if you want to switch them up a bit, you can change them. For example, think of the old phrase, "a bull in a china shop." Have you ever heard that phrase? That's supposed to mean that someone who is not delicate, they're running around, they're just wild and crazy, and they're destroying things. Well, maybe somebody could change it to "a bull in a pastry shop," which may have some different meanings. There's an old saying, "cool as a cucumber." What if you change it to "cool as a carrot"? Maybe that says something different. Also, comedians use cliches all the time, and they're giving us a little wink. They're not trying to be original with these. A few years ago, there was a great National Hockey League commercial in Canada that poked fun at sports cliches. So a lot of professional athletes will say things in a cliched way like, "I'm going to give 110% today. I'm going to take it one day at a time." So finally, I've given you examples of cliches. I've shown when you can use them. Now, some people would say, is that it? Is that all I have to do to be original? And really, I'm kind of coming at originality from a reverse angle or position. And that is, let's get cliches out of your writing first, and then the original goodness will shine through. And that's really all you need to do. So the process is simply to develop your sensibility for cliches through reading current writing in publications you enjoy. Now, if you like to read old novels, Victorian novels, you're not going to learn about the current cliches. So read high-level current publications. Second, remove cliches as often as you can while you're revising your writing. And I've shown you what some of those are today in this lecture. Next, I would say use effective detail to describe situations. One way people do that is to, let's say they want to write about the subway. What is it like to have a character in their story on the subway? Well, some people will actually go to their local subway and they'll write down details of the train, the sound of the train, the people on the train, and they use those details in their fiction writing. So that's really effective in the moment kind of detail. And also you can use fresh figurative language when you're comfortable with it. So all cliches are figurative language in some sense. So these are often combining realms of experience. And they come in the form of similes, which are phrases that use like or as. Something is like this or as this. Or metaphors, which are a little bit more complex. And they combine or relate two separate realms of experience. Now that's high-level stuff, and you don't have to do that. Just describe things in an honest, straightforward way, and I think that's enough. But sometimes you can add your own metaphors, and who knows? You may create the next cliche of your own. If you've got one of those typical grammar books, those big ones, it probably has 200 to 300 grammar or style concerns listed in it. Now, out of all of those, I think one of the most interesting ones that doesn't get enough notice amongst all the other things that you can read in the grammar books is the idea of parallelism. So if you find sometimes that you are writing very long sentences that are a bit awkward, or if a teacher or editor has ever said you write run-on sentences, then perhaps you have an issue called faulty parallelism. And I really want to focus on this and discard a lot of the other things that you read in the grammar books, because if you can master parallelism, you can write in almost a poetic style that is very easy to understand and avoids all those grammar problems. So simply put, parallelism is the use of two or more identical grammatical elements in a pattern. So I like to come up with a metaphor of the train tracks. So if you notice train tracks, they have to be obviously parallel. The two tracks have to be parallel to each other. Otherwise, the train runs off the rails. Now, this is a really simple idea and it may sound very basic, but it's rarely taught in schools today. But without parallelism, just like the train, your sentences can fall apart. So with parallelism, the writer repeats a set of verbs or a set of nouns or any other part of speech to create a pattern that is pleasing to the ear, to the mind. One of the most famous examples of parallelism is the speech by Martin Luther King. So I recommend you go onto YouTube right now, pause this video, and play back the speech by Martin Luther King called I Have a Dream. Now, he was making this speech decades and decades ago about race, about the American nation. But if you go through it, it's not just an informational speech, and he does make some points about things that he wants to have happen with race relations. But actually, there's a lot of parallelism in it. And one of the most obvious forms of parallelism in this is the repetition of the title, or at least what we came to know as the title, and that is I Have a Dream. So if you see on the slide some examples from this speech, you can see that I have a dream repeated a number of times. So parallelism can occur in terms of repeating the exact words twice or three times for emphasis. Certainly it makes an emphasis point here that he has this dream. I here is the subject or doer of the sentence, of the action. The have is the action itself. And then the receiver, or the object of the sentence in grammatical terms, is a dream. So of course, if you're going to repeat that phrase, you're also repeating the underlying structure. Sometimes parallelism can occur in the underlying grammatical structure that most people don't even notice. So you're repeating a verb and a verb, but of course the meaning of those verbs is different. Let's look at another example from King's speech that is a little bit more nuanced. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So in that case, we have parallelism in a couple of spots. Now there's the repetition of noun, but then there's a slight variation there with the next noun, which is skin, and that shifts to characters. They're both nouns, so the underlying structure is repeated. There's a noun at the end of that. And preceding those, obviously, is the pronouns there, which are repeated, obviously. But it is this poetic parallelism that makes this line very memorable. So this idea that we shouldn't judge people on the color of their skin, but the contents of their characters. When you put things into parallel series, as they're called, like that train tracks repetition here, it's also more memorable for people. So a lot of people can quote from large parts of the speech, even today, many years later, because it was put in that parallel series. And this is the trick of poetry. This is what is known by poets to make their work more memorable. Songs, popular pop songs, are written in parallel series. The whole structure of a song often has repetition. So you can use that in prose, full sentences, for great effect. Readers like this poetry. It's pleasing to the ear. It makes sentences well structured and memorable. So as with the Martin Luther King speech, I Have a Dream that I mentioned earlier, some parallelism is so obvious. It's so clear. So on the slide, I want to show you what is called some surface parallelism examples. Kind of like the Martin Luther King speech. The first sentence is,
I ran and ran and ran away from the monster. So what does this suggest? Well, it suggests the person ran a lot. Now, you could just say I ran a lot. I ran far to get away from the monster. But by just having the reader experience the ran, we get that sense that there was a lot of running. Imagine if this second sentence was written, Mozart composed and composed and composed until the music sounded right. Well, that says in that repetition of the verbs compose, compose, composed, that he did a lot of work. It wasn't like he just took 10 minutes and came up with this stuff. It took a long time. And then also you could say something out of the Fast and Furious movies. The Ferrari drifted and drifted on the dirt road. So it was doing a lot of drifting. So those are pretty obvious. But sometimes parallelism is less obvious to the reader. It's more under the surface parallelism, where the meanings of the words change, but the parts of speech that are repeated stay the same. So consider these. Sander ate and burped at dinner. So ate and burped are verbs, but they're different verbs. Priya walked and ran the marathon. The theory circulated and then settled in the discourse of the academic field. So in the second one, we have walked and ran. Those are both verbs, but they're different verbs in terms of their meaning. And then the second one, circulated and settled, have different meanings, but they are verbs. So in each case, no surface verb meanings repeat, but the structure stays the same actually in those three sentences. Now, sometimes parallelism goes wrong, and so you have a thing called faulty parallelism, and that's one of those grammar book points. So look at the first sentence on this slide. John was screaming, ran, and disappeared. What is the faulty parallelism here? Well, here ran and disappeared are in the same tense, past tense, and was screaming needs to be, in this sentence, screamed to be parallel with those other two verbs. The second sentence is the topic of creationism, and science was quite heated in the past few years. People on both sides of the debate are debating their sides, and furthermore argued vehemently in a way that does not help come to some conclusion. What is the faulty parallelism here? Well, are debating is in present tense, and then argued is in past tense, so we don't have those train tracks of equal grammatical parts of speech. Finally, Kat Thompson presents and explained the legal case. We have two verbs there, presents and explained, but one is in present tense, one is in past, so they need to be changed back to the same tenses here, the same forms in these three sentences. Now let's turn to some more examples of parallelism, specifically what are called single element parallel series. And I have 5 of these series to share with you today. There are many more. I mean, there's an infinite number of possibilities for you in parallelism. I'm just giving you a small set to get you started, to get you a sense of what parallelism is. Some of this is very simple. You can make it as complex as you want, as you can imagine. So the first type of parallel series, probably the best one, the one you can use all the time that isn't going to get worn out, is the verb series. So earlier I've mentioned in some other lectures that the verb is so important to the sentence. We want to get as many verbs as possible into our sentences because they have so much meaning in them. They provide images, they provide movement to our writing, that why not pack in as many as possible to our sentences. So we want a very high ratio of verbs to other words in our sentences. So as I said earlier in this set of lectures, that a parallel series is simply, at minimum, 2 repeated grammatical elements. So we could say something like this in verb series: I laughed and cried at the same time. So laughed and cried. 1, 2. How about this example? Larissa studied for that calculus exam, which gives off extra meaning. So of course we have that repetition of the 3 verbs, but also we know she studied a lot. And you can really extend these parallel series into very long sentences. So it's not just about simple sentences. You can add on and add on and add on and create longer sentences. For example, you could say Larissa studied for the calculus exam, and when the professor laid the exam on the desk in front of her, she trembled, shrieked, and bolted out of the lecture hall into the washroom, where she whimpered and shook for 35 minutes. So that's one sentence, but it has a lot of good parallel series, verb series here that make it easy to follow. For example, we already have the studied, and then zoom along in the sentence to trembled,
shrieked and bolted. So 3 verbs there. And then whimpered and shook, 2 interesting verbs as well. And that's the power of parallelism, is to allow you to make these long sentences that still make sense. This is not a run-on sentence. Some other examples of verb series: I write, edit, revise, and then write, edit, revise again. Or how about this one? John ate, drank more, drank too much, and he talked more and said more than he ever should have said. Now you can create a surprise in these series. So if the final element, the final verb, changes our impression of the sentence, it plays with the word. So for example, you could say, in the summer we swam, hiked, laughed, and kissed. In the winter we studied, worked, complained, and fought. So that's verb series. Get these verbs into your writing as much as possible. You can't overdo it. The next single element parallel series is the noun series. So I believe that nouns are the second best word in the sentence, second to verbs, and great nouns, strong nouns, provide a lot of images to people. Well, we can also just put them in a list. We can put them in a series for effect. So we could say something like, Julia, Tarn, Mark, Kuldeep, and Kwanzaa presented the sales pitch. So that puts the nouns, and these are names, in the start or the doer part of the sentence. So Julia, Tarn, Mark, Kuldeep, and Kwanzaa, they are all presenting the sales pitch. We didn't have to say Julia presented the sales pitch, Tarn presented the sales pitch, Mark presented the sales pitch, on and on and on. We can all combine those things. Now also you can reverse this and put the series, the noun series, at the end of the sentence. So we could say, I saw on his desk a dictionary, a thesaurus, a pen, a disc, a computer, a cup, an Oreo, and an aspirin. And there, like the verb series that I've talked about in an earlier lecture, we have a little bit of a surprise there at the end, the aspirin. So it says that maybe he's got a headache when he's sitting at that desk. So change that final element for a surprising shift. And here's some more shifts at the end of the sentence in the noun series. The town had a church, a bank, a school, and just beyond the town line, a morgue. So we can imagine when we get that sentence that this story is probably going to deal with what happens at that morgue. In an academic example, we could say Peterson's quantitative analysis project showed increases, decreases, and mistakes. So his study is problematic, and that's told by that final noun that shifts our perspective. And here's one that might have come out of something like a Stephen King story. After the accident, I saw scattered on the highway a seat, a tire, a suitcase, a doll, and a head. And if you notice in these examples, there are no adjectives in front of those nouns. It's just noun, 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 so on, with a shift at the end of each of those for a very strong effect, almost like the punchline of a joke. You can also put adjectives, so those are the words that modify nouns, into series. One big problem with writing, particularly in beginning writers of fiction, is to pepper adjectives all over their writing. So every noun has an adjective. It can become heavy. It can become a problem. What you need to do is inject adjectives using series, so using a parallel series. Inject those into sentences at the right moment. So for example, you could say gray, motionless, dull clouds hung over the picnic. So we have 1, 2, 3 adjectives, then we get the noun, and then we move on with the sentence. You could say detailed, coherent, well-argued writing makes Dr. Kilgore's book a pleasure to read. Again, we've loaded up those adjectives in a series at the beginning. Now, this series comes after the verb, the next one. She was attractive, smart, well-focused, soft-spoken, and dishonest. There's that shift that I've talked about in an earlier lecture. And remember that in the English language, we can either put adjectives before the noun, or we can put adjectives after was. And here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 adjectives. The first 4 obviously being fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with describing someone as attractive, smart, well-focused, and soft-spoken. But that last one is the problem for this person's character. And that provides that nice little shift at the end of the sentence. Now, we didn't have to spend a whole paragraph describing her character here. We can load up the adjectives, get them all out of the way, and then we can move on with describing the story here, or whatever you want to do after that sentence. So in these 3, they provide great details, these adjective series. They spice up the nouns and pronouns when needed.
But just like when you take a vodka shot at the bar, you're having a party, you're drinking, a good writer knows when to stop. You don't want to use these series over and over and over again throughout all your writing. Be careful with them. It's not like the verb series. Verb series you can use all the time as much as you want. Here, you've got to be judicious. You got to be careful of when you use these. Use these occasionally. Just like adjectives, we can get into problems with another part of speech, another word, and that is the adverb. So there's always some really bad writing out there that peppers adverbs all over the sentences. You got to be careful. You can overdo adverbs. These are words that end in ly. They modify a verb, obviously, and they can shift around sentences. They can be located in a lot of different spots, not necessarily before the verb. It can be after, it can be later on in the sentence. So what are some examples of adverb series? So these are when you want to inject some adverbs for a certain purpose, a very specific purpose, and then get out and get on and move on. You're not going to be peppering all of your sentences with adverbs. Well, you could say something like this piece that seems like it comes from a National Geographic magazine. Slowly, quietly, assuredly, the lioness circles closer and closer to a beautiful, peaceful, complacent zebra who drinks his last drink at the watering hole. So here we load up at the beginning those adverbs, slowly, quietly, assuredly. Notice also that not all adverbs have to have ly. So closer and closer modifies circles, the verb circles. So that is also an adverb, even though it doesn't have ly. And also you'll notice I put an adjective series here, beautiful, peaceful, complacent, modifying zebra. So there's a lot going on in that sentence, and the verbs are strong, the adverbs are interesting. Also, the adjective series helps out there too. That's a lot of detail, great detail in one sentence. We could say something like, I loved him wholly, unreservedly, blindly, and stupidly. Again, a surprise with stupidly. Another one, in the presentation, Dr. Gregson analyzed the argument completely and tirelessly. So that really shows that this academic, this scholar, is spending a lot of time analyzing that argument. And notice those two adverbs come right at the end of the sentence. You have to go back a bit to find the verb they modify, and that is analyzed. So these serve a purpose. They give additional details, and they're useful in the sentence. We don't pepper our sentences with adverbs. We give them in a quick shot, and then we move on from this. Another example, his voice grew quickly and wildly. So in this example, we get added detail. If we had just said his voice grew, we really don't know how it does that. And quickly and wildly is useful. Gives extra characterization of the man's voice. And make sure you test your usage of adverbs. If you can knock them off and the meaning is fine, then why would you use them? These are only used in certain moments to add a little bit of detail to those verbs. The final parallel series that I want to give you as a spark, a way of starting out on this idea, is the preposition series. So what is a preposition? Well, it's simply small linking words. For example, words like on, under, beside, during, and there's so many of these. And these express relationships between other words, between subjects and objects, according to space, logic, and time. Now, prepositions don't get much attention in the grammar books. They're just little words. We often don't even think about them very much. And they draw the most attention often when they end a sentence. So some grammarians believe that you should not end a sentence with, for example, the word to, which is a preposition. But we think they deserve a little bit more attention, and they can be used to great effect. Before I get into what those series are, there are so many prepositions, and I just want to show you some of these. Above, beside, out, within, below, beneath, over, during, under, after, to, into, on, off, with, at, without. So you can find more in the dictionary. Now, if we're going to use these singularly, so not in a series, we might say something like, the boy sits on the bike, or the boy sits beside the bike, the boy looks at the bike. But if we want to put something into series, and that's the point of these lectures, is to create that poetry of using these prepositions, we could say something like, in our country, government by, of, and for the people has become government over, around, and through the people. Now, by, of, and for the people was an old saying from centuries ago discussing political philosophy. And this has been turned around a bit. They've done another parallel series, a companion to by, of, for, which is 1, 2, 3 prepositions, and that is over, around, and through, 1, 2, 3 again. And what does that say about this current government? Well, it's saying that they are corrupt. We could also say we looked in, around, and under the shed for that cat. So it suggests the spatial relationship between we and that cat and that shed, and that is in, around, and under. Those are the prepositions. And then finally, you might recognize this example from a song by Irish rock band U2, and that is, I can't live with or without you. Seems like a contradiction. One of the most famous lines, and the song is called With or Without You, one of the most famous songs by U2, but I can't live with or without you. With and without are prepositions. And it creates, again, that poetry. 1, 2, 1, 2. So when you need to describe complex time, space, or logical relationships, the preposition series is a useful tool to do it elegantly. Don't overdo it, though. You only use this once in a while. Now let's turn to some more complex parallel series. And what we can do is actually create multiple elements in these series. We're repeating multiple elements. And I'm going to take some of the individual parts of speech that I used previously and combine them. So we could, for example, have an adjective-noun series. So here's a simple noun series first. Mark wore a hat, a jacket, a vest, and a tie. It's fine, but it really doesn't show his character. What if we make this an adjective noun series? So we're going to go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And I think this shows a lot more character about this guy, Mark. So Mark wore a purple hat, a green jacket, a red vest, and a blue tie. Wow, this guy is a real character to dress like that. He's not a conservative dresser, as maybe the noun series shows. He is someone that is more wild in his clothing with that adjective-noun series. Another multiple element series is subject-verb series, so that's a doer of the action and a verb. So this allows us to be a little bit more complex. You could say something like, in Baxton's study of the town's history, he showed that the peasants protested, landowners complained, soldiers marched, and peasants died. So what are the subject-verb series here? Well, we have peasants protested, that's the doer of the action and the action. Then we have landowners complained, again, subject-verb or doer and action. Soldiers marched, again, 1, 2, doer and action. And then peasants died. Comes full circle by the end of the sentence. A lot of action there, a lot of people doing things, and it's all interconnected. Now, somebody would have written this in another way, let's say in a non-parallel way, like this. In Baxton's study of the town's history, he showed that the peasants protested, which caused the landowners to complain, and then the soldiers marched and shot the peasants dead. Not as poetic, this sentence. Not as interesting as the first, not as straightforward as the original example. Another classic example of the subject-verb series is I came, I saw, I conquered. So this is the classic Julius Caesar Latin line, Veni, Vidi, Vici, converted to English. That's a great, powerful subject-verb series that emphasizes the I, the doer of that action. It wouldn't mean as much if you made it into a verb series. I came, saw, and conquered. Doesn't have the same effect, I don't think. It sounds like he just shrugged it off. I came, saw, conquered. No, he says I came, I saw, I conquered. It's important to repeat the doer of the action. Another type of series is subject-verb-object series, so we're getting a little more complex. For example, you could say Nicole purified the sulfur, Mary heated the acid, Kareem weighed the magnesium, and John combed his hair. So there we have the doer of the action, and a receiver, which is the sulfur. Mary is the doer again, and there's a nice verb, heated, and a receiver of that action, the object, which is the acid, and so on. Of course, there's a shift in the element here, and that is John, he's in the same grammatical structure, but he is not doing the same type of actions as the others. He's not doing the experiment. He's just combing his hair. So that's a neat little surprise there. Now, each unit of this, so where you see those commas, you could have put a period. You could put a period after in those places of the comma, remove the and near the end, and it would be 4 separate sentences. But we combine them because they are working on the same project. And then finally, another multiple element series is verb preposition object. You're not going to use this that often. Once in a while, you're going to use this. So why don't you give it a try?
This multi-element series simply repeats a verb, then one of those prepositions, which I talked about in a previous example of the preposition series, and then the object or the receiver of the action. So what does this look like in practice? Well, you could say the cat walked down the road, stopped on the sidewalk, strolled over the yard, and stared at the dog. So these were just a few examples of how you can combine grammatical elements to create those multiple or multi-element series. You can take this in any direction you want. Only your creativity will be your limitation. So try this out with other grammatical elements. See what else you can parallel beyond what I've shown here. Your readers will enjoy the poetry and also the structure of your sentences. So these examples of parallel series represent ways of adding detail quickly and compactly to your writing. So professional writers use parallelism to create a rhythm, kind of poetry, but also a solidity of their grammatical structure. Using parallel series helps writers to avoid the tendency also to sprinkle many individual parts of speech, so for example adjectives, adverbs, around their writing. Get away from that. You want to be very targeted with your use of those parts of speech, the adjectives and adverbs. Now some students say to me, wow, these series seem really simple. This is obvious stuff. Well, that's the point of this. The simplicity of these series should help you to see your sentences structurally now. As you try out parallelism, you'll start to map out your sentences more clearly in your head. They'll come out more clearly. You won't fall into that classic trap and problem that a lot of writers have of long, confusing constructions that will inevitably tire out your readers. You definitely won't fall into that dreaded run-on sentence that is so common to students writing. Sometimes that run-on sentence is also called a comma splice. I see so many comma splices in students writing where they fuse together two different parts of speech, two different elements, two different phrases that are not parallel, and it's so confusing on the reader. And you want to make your writing as straightforward, as structured as possible for the reader to follow along, and parallelism is the key to that. So I would suggest go back to some of your previous writing and see if you are doing these things, if you are possibly using faulty parallelism, falling into run-on sentences and comma splices, that sort of thing, and then restructure, edit your sentences so that you have that structure in it in the same way that Martin Luther King had structure in his famous I Have a Dream speech. Most readers won't realize what you're doing, so they won't even notice this stuff, but it's a very powerful effect. They will just enjoy it. They will just think, wow, I kind of like this writing. And you know the trick. You know the technique now to get them to have that reaction to your writing. A good drummer knows a key aspect of good writing, and that is variation. Drummers hold the band together with a consistent beat, of course, but they also break out and mix things up a little bit, varying speed, varying volume for certain effect. And these are techniques that actually good writers understand too. Now, while the drummer's unit of measure is the drum stroke, the prose writer's unit of measure is the sentence. In this set of lectures, I'm going to talk about varying your sentence structure and length for positive effects on your readers. So good writers use sentences that vary in structure for a change of pace, a little bit different pace at certain times. Good writers will vary the length of sentences to speed up the action or to slow down the reader's experience of whatever the content is. Now, there's an interfering factor in sentence length and variation, and that is the monotonous sentence. So if you ever heard a speaker give a speech and they speak in a monotonous voice that goes on and on and on and on with no variation, you know what I'm talking about already. To get a sense of the problem, just read the following paragraph, and you might even try reading it out loud to really hear the monotony that comes up with these sentences. William entered the grocery store. He looked around for candy. He walked over to the chocolate bars. The store owner said hello. William grabbed a chocolate bar. He walked over to the counter. He placed the chocolate bar on the counter. The owner rang up the price, $1.20. William handed the man the money. He stepped out the door onto the sidewalk. So this paragraph is not particularly bad, so there are not grammatical errors here. And certainly we need to see William go through this process, and there's a lot of detail here. Each sentence is grammatically correct, it's economical, it's an active voice, there's strong verbs, strong nouns, original language, and even some parallelism. These are all good things. These are all elements of good writing. But still, the paragraph fails. Indeed, the paragraph is really a mind-numbing drag. Now, this is a really extreme example of a collection of what are called segregated sentences. So segregated sentences stand on their own. Each one focuses on one point. They're often used in description or narration. Segregated sentences are oriented towards events, things happening, not so much what goes on inside a character's mind or a person's mind. It's about the external world. So they're good building blocks of writing, but they can be overused if you're not attentive to their length. Now, the fix here is very easy. So all we need to do is vary the length of some of the sentences for effect. So here is the revised version of that. William entered the grocery store and looked around for candy. He walked over to the chocolate bars and the store owner said hello. William grabbed the chocolate bar, walked over to the counter and placed it down. The owner rang up the price. $1.20. William handed the man the money and stepped out the door onto the sidewalk. So here, the sentences vary in length from 7 to 14 words, so that's a nice variation. And I think it breaks the monotony of the original. It feels more natural, right? It feels less rigid after I've done this revision. So in the next few lectures, I want to talk about sentence patterns that can break up that monotony. I want to talk about the power of the short sentence, the dreamy feel of a long sentence, and also using short and long to provide some effects in combination. Now I want to talk about some sentence patterns. So these are the first way that you can vary your sentences. If you feel like your sentences are kind of boring, too straightforward, or they're too simple, and you want to mix things up a bit, well, here are some sentence patterns that will allow you to do that. Now, many of these sentence patterns have names in the classical rhetoric. So if you want to know those things, you can go to some style books, some classic rhetoric books. But rather than list those big names for these things, I've just got some really simple names for these forms of patterns. Now, you'll see on the next few slides, I will list an equation, essentially a diagram equation for the structure under each name. So the first example of an internal order variation, so that's within the sentence, how you can vary your words, is the intrusive sentence. So as you'll see in the equation, that means you have a sentence. Let's call it sentence A. And within it, you use 2 dashes and you put another full sentence. So that has to be grammatically correct. It's not a fragment. It's a real sentence embedded within sentence A, which continues after sentence B. So consider these examples. He did not deserve his father's hatred. Does any 4-year-old deserve its father's hatred? But he faced abuse regularly. Another one. The birthday greeting, Daniela sends the same card to everybody, reads, "Happy birthday to my closest friend." The conditioned stimulus, this part of the evidence is crucial, failed to produce the anticipated results. So you see with these 3 examples, if we just remove what's between those dashes, we have what's essentially a full sentence. But we have to wait until we get that little bit of information about sentence B before we can finish that sentence. So this just gives you some examples of how you can add some information in full sentence form to another sentence. A second type of sentence pattern is called the end beginning. And the formula is simply a clause of some sort, then a repeating element, period. So the sentence ends. And then we start a new sentence, and we have that same repeating element that finished the first sentence plus a clause. Some examples. What you have described is life. Life is tough. So you can see the repeating element is life. That's at the end of the first sentence. And then we begin the next sentence with the reversal of that same element. Life is tough. Another one, Markovitch wanted Smith to reveal the evidence. Reveal the evidence. Smith did. Robinson turned on the electricity and his invention hummed. His invention hummed and changed his life forever. I think what's most important with these variations between sentences is that there's a coherence there. We're almost linking the first sentence to the second sentence by repeating that element. It forces the reader to think about those two sentences together. Another sentence pattern is beginning, beginning, and again, the equation is just a repeating element plus a clause, period, and then a repeating element and a clause, period. For example, the door slammed and the house shook. The door slammed and our marriage ended. Smith's theory seemed original to himself. Smith's theory seemed unoriginal to the committee. The court system sends the guilty to jail. The court system sends the innocent to jail. So again, we're forced to, in that repeating element, consider both sentences together. They're connected ideas. You can also do end-end repeat, so a clause and a repeating element, and then a period, and a clause and a repeating element. For example, you could say, he was a sniveling, whiny little brat. I wanted to kill that whiny little brat. Again, emphasis on the whiny little brat, that repeating element. Another one, before we had money, we worried about money. After we got money, we still worried about money. And then finally, the price of a car was high. The cost of a banana was high. So again, the repeating element comes at the end of each sentence. That's was high. And that last one suggests simply that there's some sort of strange inflation going on here or scarcity of bananas, which might say a lot about the country that this person is in. And I think when you repeat the end element, that sticks in the reader's mind. It sticks with them. It stays with them as they read on. Another form of variation is beginning end. So that is, you have a repeating element that starts the sentence, then you have a clause, and you finish the sentence with another repeating element. So for example, forever is a long time, and I intend to live forever. So forever and forever begin and end that sentence. Sam, whatever you say about him, is still Sam. Problems led to more problems. I think this example of sentence variation reminds me a lot of old sayings that you've heard before, you read online. So if you just repeat those beginning and ending elements, you can have your own kind of saying. So those are a few ways that you can vary your sentences. Now you want to be careful with this, so you don't want to write in this way with these patterns in every sentence. Of course, if you use that last style all the time, you will draw attention to yourself. You will draw attention to the technique as opposed to the content. But once in a while, when you really want to make a good point, it's good to put it into these varied patterns. Here's a tip that veteran writers know, and that is the length of a sentence affects the comprehension by the reader of that sentence. And you want to use short sentences that make single points when you want to make sure that the reader understands what you're saying, or if you want to show very quick actions. Here's an example in fiction or creative nonfiction of using these short sentences. I punch. He jumps back. He lunges at me. I grab his arm. I throw him down on the mat. I hold him. The referee smacks the mat. 1, 2, 3. I win the championship for the first time. So in real life, these punches, jumps, lunges, grabs, and throws occur as short, quick movements. So in real life, not in the sentence, but in real life, they are quick, short movements. Short, quick sentences, on the other hand, replicate that same meaning in real life, creating what we call a symbiosis. Form matches content. Also, the reader speeds through these short sentences and really feels the quickness of the real-life actions. Now, that last sentence slows things down a bit. We linger on that final sentence for variation. Now, when it comes to making individual points, as I said earlier, sometimes when we have long sentences, particularly in academic writing, so if you're doing any academic writing, you know that you often have these very long 20, 30, 40, even 50 word sentences that pack in so many points. But of course, that requires the reader to follow your train of thought. And if you've got a lot of points packed into a sentence, then it's harder for the reader to follow you. It's easy also for the reader to overlook something in a long sentence, and you don't want any of your points to be overlooked. So maybe in those situations, whether it's academic writing, business writing, political writing, a sequence of short sentences in the right moment, so not all the time, but in the right moment, provides points that the reader cannot overlook. So consider this sentence. During wartime, they thought traitors lurked everywhere. Your dentist could be a communist. Your butcher could be a communist. Your father could be one too. So see there, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 sentences that are all relatively short. When the reader encounters this academic piece of writing, they certainly won't miss any of these points. The period provides a nice break, a chance to breathe mentally. So the longest sentence in this paragraph contains just 7 words. There's no ands or buts that are connecting more sentences or more clauses. Nothing at all gets lost. So those are 2 examples of when you will want to use short sentences for a powerful, powerful effect on your reader's comprehension. Long sentences have their own unique effect. They're loosely structured, so they're inherently ambient, atmospheric, they're impressionistic. I think they're really useful for depicting things like dreams, intense emotions, and also observational scene setting, when we kind of want to pan across a scene and show that to the reader. They're often called freight train sentences. If you imagine a car after a car after a car on a train being pulled along. In a freight train sentence, grammatical units repeat, and those units are coupled with conjoining words, so little conjunctions, like and or but. And I think the freight train sentence is really good for depicting dreams, because dreams don't stop and start abruptly the way fights do. I showed you in a previous lecture how the short sentence is great for depicting the actions, the short, quick actions of a fight. Well, in a dream, you don't have those short, quick actions, so why don't we use the form of the sentence to connect with the content of the sentence? To show a dream in a long, drawn-out, meandering sentence. Dreams obviously move smoothly from location to location, with juxtapositions of people, of places. We're flying along often in a dream, and we're in one location, then we're in another. How did that happen? I don't know. So consider this dream sequence. I'm not going to read it out loud. I just want you to pause the video for a second as this comes on the screen and get a sense of this freight train rolling along. So here, the reader, you, experiences the dream not just in the meaning, so the content of it, but also in the form of it. Now, the key to writing this grammatically and not running into a run-on sentence or a comma splice, as they're called in the grammar books, is those little conjunctions, those connecting words like and or but or so. And those connectors can't be complicated, or the sentence will be too complicated. Without the proper connecting words, it becomes, as I said, a run-on sentence, essentially a grammatical train wreck. Now, when placed under the pressure of intense emotions, people often lose their train of thought. Stress increases, heartbeats accelerate, blood runs hot, they can't think straight. And in the next example, thoughts rush through this boy's mind. I'll let you pause on this slide, read it yourself, get the sense of the freight train, the intense emotions coming through in the form as well as the content. And in this example, the writer never tells you the boy's feelings. Instead, we sense what the boy feels from those physical details. The length of this and the flowing nature of it mimics his emotional state. Now, authors sometimes use a freight train sentence at the beginning of a story to help us look around a location to set the scene. This is like the start of a movie when you see an establishing shot of a location, whatever it is, Central Park in New York City or the desert in the Middle East. The camera pans across and we see something like this. Again, I'll let you pause this video on this freight train sentence to get a sense of it. I think we have a camera in our mind's eye here, and we look around this landscape. So those are some uses of the long sentence. I'm sure you'll find more as you get familiar with the freight train style. You can use them in essays, academic writing, And the great thing about this is we can have a lot of information in a sentence that actually is really easy to follow. It's not grammatically incorrect, but just be cautious. You do not want to use long sentences very often. Use them sparingly in the right moment at the right time when you want to create that effect, when you want to slow down the reader's experience of the moment. You want to give them an impressionistic feel. That's when you throw in a freight train sentence once in a while. When it comes to the length of a sentence for variation, short isn't better, long isn't better. I'm not picking sides here between one or the other. A succession of short sentences, as I've shown you in these lectures, may become choppy. It may become monotonous. A succession of long sentences weighs down your writing. For the reader, it's like walking through quicksand to go through those succession of long sentences. The point here is just to vary your sentence lengths for whatever effect you want to create, and your reader will feel that effect. There's a great contrast, actually, if you can put a short sentence right after a long sentence, for example. That makes a resounding point that no reader can overlook. And consider this example on the slide. I'll let you pause this video and read it over yourself and feel the effect here in this academic writing example. This paragraph on early Canadian newspapers includes 3 reasonably long sentences. Nobody would say those are short sentences. But what stands out is the final short sentence, partisanship reigned. It's only 2 words. It's the shortest sentence you can have in the active voice, and the author emphasizes one point, that partisanship was so important to early Canadian newspapers. It acts like an exclamation point at the end of the sentence, and it's also really a welcome break. Readers love these welcome breaks where they don't have to do much processing of the sentence. So the major point here is when you want to slow down a reader's experience for whatever reason, you use long sentences. When you want to speed up and get really fast and you want the reader to feel like they are right there with you experiencing that fast, quick, real-life movement, then use short sentences. Now, your variation doesn't have to be as extreme as the example I've just given, to have a 2-word sentence after a number of longer sentences. You just need a slight difference in sentence lengths to have any similar effect. And I think your readers will appreciate that little change of pace.